and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
So we'll start again. Someone keeps deactivating my mic, but like I said, referring to what we're talking about, New World Order, Rothschild's, Federal Reserve, central banks, what they're known to be known as, although a lot of people were sceptical of. What was started off was 2.3 trillion, which was 25% missing through Pentagon, DoD, Department of Defense, September the 10th, 2001, day before 9/11. Connection to who could afford that, and the Federal Reserve, Central Bank of America, which is privately owned, not government owned, and then the Rothschild family, what they were said to be before, 500 trillion or more. Who could afford that? Someone with that kind of money, especially to lose or go missing. 25%, and that's not even off 500 trillion. Regarded as richest family in the world, but like I said before, I've not actually found proof to say that they are worth as much as they're said to be, but I know they are rich. What I was saying about Russia's central bank, which is privately owned, as far as I know, BIS, and then UK's Bank of England or something, most likely possibly owned, referring to Nathan Rothschild, who basically admitted that he owns the UK, based on what he said years ago. Like I said, Evelyn Rothschild mentions on this video international currency. International means worldwide, connection to New World Order. That tells me a lot based on that one. International world order, you'd call it in another term, world martial law. Churchill, etc. They've mentioned this New World Order, quite a few people in the past, as being a plan already. Although probably would have been missed unless people were noticed, which luckily some people put together. Same, like I said, same interview, Evelyn Rothschild mentions weather apps. Like I said, basically near enough every single phone app, which are known as spying apps, leaked by Snowden himself, amongst Messenger, Facebook and stuff. They're basically what they were: global surveillance program, prison program, DoD, etc. 25% missing, 2.3 trillion. And then, like I said, refer back to the Federal Reserve, who owns that, privately listed and not government owned. Like I said, then what we're referring to, what we were saying about the bankers' wars, China, Russia, US, close to World War III, the Cold War, which was the last one, which was close to the use of nuclear weapons. And like I said, look at what we've got going on now, I won't be surprised. Then I was moving on to the use of WMDs, possibility of them being used in World War III. Based on what Ike says, in one interview, problem, reaction, solution method, where they would say, the solution, the World War III, we used WMDs, only solution is to bring in this, world martial law, New World Order, whatever, order of the New World as the solution. People agree, and then all of a sudden they realise it's not what they were told. Based on this martial law, which is being introduced to America, like I said, gun control, which has a lot of holes in those stories, based on false flag ops, to disarm American citizens just in case they stand up against what they realise is happening. Militarised police and stuff, to me it's all a part of this, what's going on. RDIF chips, as I said, being given to people, again, not knowing the full story in America. Basically what you put on animals, and these things carry their information. Also possibly can be seen through cameras and stuff. Things like that, also connected to mind control. As I said, I've got an implant under my skin. Someone in America, she said she has one, probably other people as well, basically discovered that they were under mind control after discovering these implants, being given them. Like I said, internet phone apps connected to GCHQ, NSA, global surveillance program, spying on us as citizens across the world. To me, as I said, it's a preparation for this pre-planned New World Order. Basically, so when it comes and it's introduced, we're basically, they're already ready for us. And if they're spying on us and stuff and giving us these chips and whatever they're doing, it means they have a reason to do this based on one world government, one world army. Like I said, EU referendum, they're planning to scrap that over in the UK. Like I said, the old 1600s Act legally would basically give them the right to introduce a martial law easier than it would be based on the EU rules, human rights, if that was introduced, where, again, another martial law could be, because, our rights are signed away to them, and they get to say democracy taken away. This is why we're saying, that would be two countries, America, UK, which could be put under martial law. America's basically saying they're going to introduce it soon, and like I said, preparation for world martial law, new world order. That's two countries already showing signs of possible signs of UK of this already being planned and ready to be introduced soon. The reasons behind political activists who are convicted or persecuted by both UK, US government, or vice versa, as if they're owned by the same people. Both nations, United Kingdom, United States, refer to the privately owned banks, Central Bank, Bank of England, Rothschild owned, and then Federal Reserve private owned, who are said to be the Rothschilds. The only people that seem or would be bothered if people were basically speaking out against them or mention anything that could foil any kind of things they were doing behind the shadows. Like I said, false flag ups are what have been known to be most likely or possible, always based on economic profits, or profits for resource, but still to do with money, motive wise. And then we've got, like I said, the 1776 dated $1 bill. Latin, it says Order of the New World, or something like in Latin. This would partially prove the pre-planned New World Order since 1776, and every war from then, Civil War, like I said, Waterloo, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Cold War, etc. All the way to 9/11, false flag ups, and all of those things since then. Like I said, lots of older prime ministers, presidents who mentioned, the New World Order, and I'll leave that up on there. And then, trying to keep this as brief as possible. But then what we've got going on recently now is, the Russia-US conflict going on. What I was saying about that was, again, based on economics, put aside of what I've been talking about recently. But like I said before, all of this stuff happened between Snowden, etc. Everything to do with that. Russia-US mainly. Russia and US were having conflicts based on economics, and it was to do with the ruble and oil. And basically, the US wanted more control or full control of, Russia's economic system. Probably before then or around the same time, Putin actually spoke at a conference live or something, talking about or exposing this New World Order, the plan and the Rothschilds. And like I said, all of a sudden, after both of those things, the Snowden incident and possible war, World War III is going on. And basically what I was saying, it's like they were, without realising, they would have exposed themselves. More than coincidental that, not long after Putin near enough mentions Rothschild, New World Order plans, all these things are going on between Russia, US mainly, Ukraine, UK, etc. Why did all of these things suddenly happen if what he was talking about was a load of shit? And what I basically was putting across was the same thing as Woodrow Wilson said about those powers above presidents, etc., who dare not speak of these people. And like I said, it wouldn't make a difference of any other leader across the world, not just America. That if this banking cartel, those people, which I believe that Putin would also be in the same situation. And like I said, all of a sudden, all this stuff was going on, or started happening after that conference. To me, all these things, what I've connected, they point out the obviousness behind everything that's been talked about. And as I said, if people are sceptical and they still don't grasp what I'm coming across and what I'm trying to tell them, well, I don't have hope for them. But like I was saying, the connection again, based on, like false flag ops, corporate owned media, deception, etc. And things like that behind those, again referred to ex-Mossad agent who said, by deception thou shalt do war. And like I said, Sun Tzu, Art of War, or war is based on deception, media deception, which has been shown through false flag. And then we've got the Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, Israel. Rothschild, Tel Aviv, Rothschild Boulevard, Tel Aviv, Mossad agent, probably the Mossad's slogan, which is by deception thou shalt do war, media deception based, connected to, holes in stories to do with 9/11/7/7, basically to say that they were used as deception. To me, the obviousness points out about the Rothschilds family and their banking cartel as they're known, and all of these things referring back to 1776 and all those wars, etc., that have happened since then. Like I said, Nathan Rothschild basically admitted that he runs this country that we're living in. If you're in the UK, he said basically any person who plays to be, like a prime minister isn't really the person running it. They're like his puppet. And like I said, it'll be no different to the United States or any other country. They have full economic control. But again, there's a reason why they deny anything that's put forward about them, if it's ever mentioned, and why it seems that the corporate owns news, government controls, etc. always ridicule people like me, etc. as loonies and stuff, based on the fact that they're trying to hide that they're doing this, based on the 99% versus 1% rich, what they're doing to us all, as if they know if we woke up, it'd be like I said, soldiers turning around on a general, and where the general realises that he's not as powerful if his men stand up against him. And like I said, divide and conquer would be based on that division system I mentioned between religion, race, etc., etc. To keep us seeing each other as our enemy, media deception, plus economic control, financial control, to keep us busy, distracted with everything, and the lies to keep us, not realising who our real enemy is. Why we call them as an enemy, because, based on as seen how we're basically treated as human beings and stuff like that. Very inhumane and near enough like animals and stuff. Like I said, although the last recording break was, there must be people apart from Snowden, etc., that like Secret Service who also know of them. And like I said, based on like their money and power, a lot of people are too scared to look into or investigate or even attempt to. But sometimes you got to put your neck on the line and take that leap. Only reason why I'm not too fussed, as I said, is because I've got nothing to lose. And if I can wake people up, then I do. And if I get shot on or killed, then I do. But at least I tried. So cheers.
Track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
And amazingly, that exact place that quote plane hit was where all the computers were stored for what Rumsfeld talked about.
Saying it is time to move away from the era of big ground wars like Afghanistan. Time to cut the U.S. military into a lean, mean team ready for 21st century war.
It would be a big change, rethinking America's military, our enemies, our wars, and how much we spend. On the chopping block, the number of America's soldiers, from a proposed 490,000 down to as low as 440,000. Watch America's forces spike during World War II, during Korea, Vietnam. These new cuts would see America with the fewest soldiers since before all of these wars. And in the skies, a 40-year-old aircraft, the A-10 Warthog, to be retired, to be replaced by newer aircraft, including the fearsome F-35 fighter jet. And the famed spy plane, the U-2, would be replaced by an unmanned drone. While at the same time, America will continue to invest in its special operations forces and cyber warfare.
We chose further reductions in troop strength in order to sustain our readiness and technological superiority.
But predicting the future of war is never
We have
perfect
before
science.
us the opportunity to forge, for ourselves and for future generations, a new world order. A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
Critics say the cuts signal a weakness and an opportunity to future enemies.
Talked about this for years. This is the inevitable process when you go down to the path of the ineffectual European state. Europe now is a collection of boutique countries. And the reason why is because of government programs that are being funded in part by cutting their military. This is exactly what you must do. As our government expands, as we've seen with Obamacare, how do you pay for that? Well, you shrink the military. So what you've got is this incredibly dependent society, and they can't defend themselves. That is not any way to preserve freedom. To preserve freedom, you got to have small government, big army, not big government, tiny army. This is the decline of the West that we thought would come, and this is how it's going to be.
And I think we're not perceived as having the power that we once did. I think President Obama has a number of upcoming trips planned overseas for the rest of his tenure. What's he going to say? I'm wondering, what is he going to say? Is he going to say that I downsized the military? Is this why he's doing this now, so we can go around to the world and say, see, we're not as strong as we were before?
Actually, you're not just cutting the military. What you're actually cutting is military pay. You're cutting military benefits.
After 13 years of war, changes are coming to all branches of the military.
It is the Army that will take the biggest hit in terms of a smaller force, the smallest since before World War II, from 522,000 to 450,000. The National Guard will also be reduced by 20,000, and the Marine Corps reduced to a force of 182,000. For the Navy, the number of carriers will remain at 11, but the number of littoral combat ships will go from 52 to 32.
What do you think of these plans?
Well, I think they're inevitable because they're being forced by Congress. Congress has mandated substantial cuts through what they call sequestration. And this sequester has had devastating impact because it's across the board without any regard to the overall strategy. And I think what Secretary Hagel has done is to try and shape the forces to fit the president's strategy, national security strategy, which is the way it's supposed to be done, rather than just hacking a budget across the board, affecting everybody without regard to what the strategy or the missions are. So I think he's trying to make the best of a very difficult situation, but Congress, if they want to reduce the size of the national debt and the annual deficits, they have to be willing to belly up to the bar, so to speak, and pass on various missions. But you can reduce the size of the force, but you must do it in a way that protects readiness. That means training and equipping and making sure that the unit cohesion is solid so that you don't have a hollow force. And that's why these cuts are really tailored to make sure that readiness is not sacrificed. They will sacrifice modernization. Modernization will be delayed, and there will be other impacts. But if you're going to have a Congress that says we're going to cut across the board, this is a better approach than what Congress has adopted. To look at this very carefully as you downsize to make sure you don't go below a certain level. When I was at the Pentagon, we had roughly 485,000 in the Army active duty. So they're planning to cut down to roughly 450. Some would take it down much further. When you start getting much further down than the 450, then you're running into a situation which I think you're compromising our security. But that's a decision that the President and the Congress working together will have to resolve, as well as the American people.
And I'm hearing very strongly that the US is going to keep up its military readiness and that it will be able to get involved in battles overseas as well as protect its own interests. But I'm just wondering on a psychological level what message this downsizing is sending to the world, because the US touts itself as the global police. But is it not stepping back in that role now?
Well, you have to also look at capability. And even though the size of the force may be coming down, the capability will be going up in terms of the modern systems that will be used. We also have to face the new cyber world. And this is something that hasn't been emphasized enough, that the capacity for state actors, to be sure, but non-state actors as well, to really attack our infrastructure, our ability to conduct business in this country, our ability to maintain our national defense capabilities. All of that is subject to attack today. And so the cyber defense, cyber modernization, cyber offensive capability is going to be very important moving forward. So I think the President is correct to raise this to a much higher level than it's been today, because most people are completely unaware of the tens of thousands of attacks that are taking place daily, stealing intellectual property, to be sure, but also probing ways in which an opponent, be it state actor or non-state actor, could shut down critical elements of our ability to
Today I'm
function
announcing the
as a
key
society.
decisions that I have recommended to the President for the Defense Department's fiscal year 2015 budget and beyond. These recommendations will adapt and reshape our defense enterprise so that we can continue to protecting this nation's security in an era of unprecedented uncertainty and change. As we end our combat mission in Afghanistan, this will be the first budget to fully reflect the transition DoD is making for after 13 years of war, the longest conflict in our nation's history. We are repositioning to focus on the strategic challenges and opportunities that will define our future. New technologies, new centers of power, and a world that is growing more volatile, more unpredictable, and in some instances, more threatening to the United States. This defense strategy is focused on defending the homeland against all strategic threats.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists.
Building security globally by projecting U.S. influence and deterring aggression, and remaining prepared to win decisively against any adversary should deterrence fail. To fulfill this strategy, DoD will continue to shift its operational focus and forces to the Asia-Pacific, sustain commitments to key allies and partners in the Middle East and Europe, maintain engagement in other regions, and continue to aggressively pursue global terrorist networks. Our reviews made two new realities very clear. First, the development and proliferation of more advanced military technologies by other nations. That means that we are entering an era where American dominance on the seas, in the skies, and in space can no longer be taken for granted. Given these realities, we must now adapt, innovate, and make difficult decisions to ensure that our military remains ready and capable, maintaining its technological edge over all potential adversaries. However, as a consequence of large budget cuts, our future force will assume additional risks in certain areas. In crafting this package, we prioritize DoD's strategic interests and match them to budget resources. This required a series of difficult choices.
I get tired of saying that defense is to be made an excuse for wasting dollars. I don't believe we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to.
I seriously question an increase in the Pentagon budget in the face of the department's recent Inspector General's report. How can we seriously consider a $50 billion increase in the defense budget when DoD's own auditors say the department cannot account for $2.3 trillion in transactions in 1 year alone?
It is, I was going to say terrifying. It is such a monumental task. I have met with two former officials of the Pentagon who served in the budget and controller and those areas. And I've mused over the fact that I've read some of these things and asked what they thought.
We process nearly 10 million paychecks a month. 10 million times to get things screwed up. I've had my pay screwed up 6 times since I've been in the department. And it's really bad when you screw up your boss's pay.
I doubt, to be honest, that people inside the department are going to be capable of sorting this out. I have a feeling it's going to take some folks from outside to come in and look at this and put in place a process that over a period, and I regret to say, but I've seen how long things take. I think it's going to take a period of years to sort it out, and I think it'll probably take the cooperation of the Congress to try to get the system so that you can actually manage the financial aspects of that institution rather than simply report on things that have happened imperfectly.
There's more oversight over the Head Start program than there is over the entire military budget.
It's a terrible record, and it's preposterous that the Defense Department doesn't know what's happened to this money.
This situation's a disgrace. It tells me that we can't meet our constitutional obligations to the taxpayers of our country to make sure that things are honestly and legally spent.
We were told major cuts in education programs, and then we read, well, $500 million is paid per year that isn't owed.
It is an incredible thing that we arm the world and then turn around and come to Congress and say, look at all these weapons out there. They're almost superior to ours. They're comparable to ours. Well, of course they are. They're ours. We sold them to them.
Since the end of the Cold War, we've sold more military weapons than the rest of the world combined.
My name is Jack Shanahan, Vice Admiral, U.S. Navy, retired. One of our nuclear bombs blows up Hiroshima 15 times over. 5 devastates Russia. After that, this is how many the U.S. has left. I feel safe reducing nuclear weapons. Well, world wars change worlds. And if you have a global agenda, then global problems allow you to offer global solutions. And if you look how the world was transformed by the First World War and the Second World War, the world was a completely different place after both of those wars. And the idea all along has been to have a third world war to complete the transformation into a global state with a world government and a world army dictating to the global population. But if they try to take Crimea back, Putin's ego and Putin's pride will no way, I would strongly suspect, allow him just to let them do it.
Exactly.
And therefore, that if they try to take Crimea back, then what you're looking at is a war, a calculated war against Russia.
Yeah.
And if you start a front against Russia on its borders, and then all this stuff going on in the Middle East, you are diluting Russia's impact on what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And it's all a setup. And when you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are 51st states of the United States, there are many of those, mind, funding this ISIS and funding this terrorism, while the Americans, who could tell them to stop any time, are saying, are condemning the very terrorism that their 51st states are supporting. Well, the picture's so bloody obvious. It's a setup, and it's a setup to attempt to trigger World War III.
The Libyan regime does not meet the criteria of a democratic country by any parameters. It's obvious. I can't add more. But of course, it's a complicated country based on relations between tribes. It needs special regulation. The situation in the country collapsed into military conflict, but it doesn't mean you or anyone can interfere by defending one side. About the UN resolution, which gives grounds for the present military intervention. This resolution is defective. If we look at what is written there, it becomes obvious that it allows anyone to take any action against a sovereign state. And it reminds me of the medieval call for a crusade, when countries call on each other to go out and liberate something. Now, concerning the core of events, by the way, Russia didn't vote for this resolution. It's obvious that this is military interference from the outside. But you know, I don't worry more about this military intervention. There are a lot of military conflicts going on, and unfortunately will unfold in future. I'm worried more about the ease with which decisions are being made to use force in international affairs nowadays. For example, it has become a steady trend in US policy. During Clinton's era, they bombed Yugoslavia and Belgrade. Bush invaded Afghanistan. Iraq was invaded under far-fetched false pretenses, liquidating an entire administration, including Saddam's children. And now it's Libya's turn. It opens with a pretext to defend civilians, but it's the civilians who die under the bombs during airstrikes. Where is the logic and conscience here? Both are absent. There are already victims among the civilians. What I want to say here is that we want and we plan to live in peace with everybody. We desire not to quarrel with anyone, and more so to be at war. But current developments in Libya confirm Russia's policy of building up its defenses is correct.
Interest when it comes to important decisions like this. Is there anything else that we need to understand about this kind of creation of war that's happening right in front of our eyes?
Well, it's a progression. And you have to connect the dots to see the progression. Going into Afghanistan was stage one, justified by the lie about 9/11 and who was really behind it. Then they go into Iraq. That has created the situation where this ISIS can now run riot. They want to go down into Africa, and so they're creating terrorism all over Africa. And so one of the big blocks to what they wanted was Colonel Gaddafi. And so they had to get rid of him. That was what the Libya thing was about, where they trained, armed and funded rebels to attack the Gaddafi regime.
Al-Qaeda rebels at that when we're supposed to be fighting Al-Qaeda.
Exactly, and to attack the Gaddafi regime, and when they responded, it was, he's killing his own people. No, he's responding to people you funded to attack him. And then these rebels and others then moved into Syria after they'd done the thing in Libya, and they did the same there. And they thought that Syria would go like Libya, but it hasn't. That's been a big problem for them. And when they wanted to, because they were behind the time, they wanted to push that on. That's when they did the chemical weapons scam, which was not Assad's work at all. That would have been suicide. He's not that stupid.
It worked in Iraq once, and then Russia came in, stepped in, blocked it off, and also popular support stopped the war in Syria.
Yeah, and your popular rejection of bombing another country stopped that being pushed on. So they're behind the scenes on Syria. And when we realise that, we can see that events are not random, but coldly calculated. These people are sheer, undiluted evil. And people need to understand that. Otherwise, they will reject that anyone could do what they're doing and kill and maim and slaughter so many people. They can do it because they have no heart, they have no empathy, they have no emotional compassion. And thus, mayhem is their currency, and they have no emotional consequence. They are not like us. So don't judge what they'll do by what you would do, because it ain't the same thing.
To understand the future, we have to understand the past. David, thank you so much.
a need for a new world order, but it has different characteristics in different parts of the world.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
A world in which there is the very real prospect of a new world order.
It's about the future of Europe and a new world order.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
And the hope that each of us has to build a new world order.
The pieces are in flux. Soon they will settle again. Before they do, let us reorder this world around us.
So that the problem of the Bush presidency will be the emergence of a new international order.
Within the next 4 years, we will see the emergence of a new international order.
The beginning of a new international order.
But today, with Asia already outproducing Europe, India and China are clearly becoming part of our new order.
So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, a new world is emerging. It is a new world order with significantly different and radically new challenges.
I think his task will be to develop an overall strategy for America in this period when really a new world order can be created. It's a great opportunity. It isn't just a crisis.
That this crisis, in the way that has developed, will require some kind of a world governance.
Good evening, everybody. President Obama and British Prime Minister Gordon today calling for a new world order to tackle our global economic crisis.
And the president outlined his vision of a new world order in which the U.S. would participate fully.
We've got to give them a stake in creating the kind of world order that I think all of us would like to see.
So I see a world order in the future with a multipolar world order.
I think a new world order is emerging, and with it the foundations of a new and progressive era of international cooperation. We have resolved that from today we will together manage the process of globalization to secure responsibility from all and fairness to all.
And one of the ways it will drive the change is through global governance and global agreements. But in a globalized economy, we are going to have to take global responsibilities, and there is going to have to be some semblance of global governance.
Never before has a new world order had to be assembled from so many different perceptions, or on so global a scale. Nor has any previous order had to combine the attributes of the historic balance of power system with global democratic opinion and the exploding technology of the contemporary period.
There also exists an extraordinary opportunity to form for the first time in history a truly global society.
Well, during the conflict with Saddam Hussein, which he handled so superbly in a short-term sense, we kept talking about a new world order. And then President Bush, at the end of that war, promised he would give 4 graduation addresses, 4 commencement addresses, describing that new world order and what America's role was going to be in it. Turned out he gave one of those addresses and canceled the other 3 and talked about something else. That's why, because they weren't ready yet.
That in fact we're all going to have to give up a little bit of our sovereignty in order to make the world work.
And I strongly believe India will be a central actor in the new world order.
And this present window of opportunity during which a truly peaceful and interdependent world order might be built will not be here for too long. Already there are powerful forces at work that threaten to destroy all of our hopes and efforts to erect an enduring structure of global cooperation.
Are you optimistic a global system can happen from what we've heard so far?
It could happen, and in fact it's in the works.
I mean, but sir, just one thing, we could go on about how your family committed all these acts against society, but we just want to let you know the New World Order has no legitimacy, and that we as a people are not afraid, and we are waking up to the robber barons and the big banksters who are looting the economy with the Federal Reserve.
Well,
we just want to let you know the New World Order has no legitimacy, and that we as a people are not afraid, and we are waking up to the robber barons and the big banksters who are looting this economy with the Federal Reserve.
Well,
On September 10th, 2001, you'll notice Donald Rumsfeld made a speech that the Pentagon had lost almost $3 trillion worth of unaccounted for expenses. Then you can see what happened on September 11th and notice that story disappeared.
I was going to say terrifying.
There could be a large cover-up going on.
And I've mused over the fact that I've read some of these things and asked what they thought.
It was major headlines on that morning of September 11th, where the day before Donald Rumsfeld made that speech, trillions of dollars gone.
Pentagon, the day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists. The adversary is closer to home.
It's the Pentagon bureaucracy. He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat. In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death. Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. And in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten. My 03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending. More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. $2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. To understand how the Pentagon can lose track of trillions, consider the case of one military accountant who tried to find out what happened to a mere $300 million. We know it's gone, but we don't know what they spent it on. Jim Minery, a former Marine turned whistleblower, is risking his job by speaking out for the first time about the millions he noticed were missing from one defense agency's balance sheets. Minery tried to follow the money trail, even crisscrossing the country looking for records. The director looked at me and says, "Why do you care about this stuff?" It took me aback, you know. My supervisor asked me why I care about doing a good job. So. He was reassigned and says officials then covered up the problem by just writing it off. They got to cover it up. That's where the corruption comes in. They've got to cover up the fact that they can't do the job. The Pentagon's Inspector General partially substantiated several of Minery's allegations, but could not prove officials tried to manipulate the financial statements. 20 years ago, Pentagon employee Franklin C. Spinney made headlines exposing what he calls the accounting games. He's still there, and although he does not speak for the Pentagon, he believes the problem has gotten worse. Those numbers are pie in the sky. The books are cooked routinely, year after year after year. Retired Vice Admiral Jack Shanahan commanded the Navy's Second Fleet, the first time Donald Rumsfeld served as Defense Secretary. With good financial oversight, we could find $48 billion if it was changed in that building without having to hit the taxpayer. In the 2.5 minutes since this report began, the Pentagon has spent nearly $2 million, and it may never know where 25% of those tax dollars went. In Los Angeles, I'm Vince Gonzalez for Eye on America. Mr. Secretary, according to the Comptroller General of the United States, there are serious financial management problems at the Pentagon, to which Mr. Cooper alluded. Fiscal year 1999, $2.3 trillion missing. Fiscal year 2000, $1.1 trillion missing. And DOD is the number one reason why the government can't balance its checkbook. The Pentagon has claimed year after year that the reason it can't account for the money is because its computers don't communicate with each other. My second question, Mr. Secretary, is who has the contracts today to make those systems communicate with each other? How long have they had those contracts? And how much have the taxpayers paid for them? Finally, Mr. Secretary, after the last hearing, I thought that my office was promised a written response to my question regarding the 4 war games on September 11th. I have not yet received that response, but would like for you to respond to the questions that I've put to you today, and then I do expect the written response to my previous question, hopefully by the end of the week.
Thank you, Representative. The second question, I've forgotten what the second question was.
I think Ms. Jonas knows it.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. McKinney. I appreciate the question. I appreciate your interest in the Department's financial condition, and we are working very hard on that program. I've just come back recently. I understand that you're working hard on it, but my question was, who has the contract? How long have they had that contract? And how much money have we spent on it? In general, we spend about $20 billion in the Department on Information Technology Systems. The accounting systems are part of that. I can get you the exact number for the record of what we spend on our current, what we call legacy systems, and those that we're moving toward. And who has the contracts? That would be a multitude of individuals. Could you name some, please? Well, I think off the top of my head, well, I would rather not. I'd rather provide that for the record. That's not privileged information, is it? I'm sure it's not. Well, please. And we still have time, so please. I would be glad to provide for the record. I don't want to talk from the top of my head and be incorrect.
This is Trump's Seekers. Well, if you can give me information to that effect,
I'm sure you are interested in all of the information that I have, and I'll be more than happy to provide it to you.
Good, thank you.
But I would also like to get information from you.
Okay.
For example, the information that I just requested about who has those contracts.
Let me assure the gentlelady that we'll make sure that this exchange of information takes place. And Mr. Secretary, if you can get back with us on the DynCorp story, we'll get that to the gentlelady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll get back on both of the first two questions, but the Congresswoman has raised the other question twice now, and I'd like to have General Myers respond because you mentioned it in the last hearing, and I think it'd be helpful to get the answer even though we're on red. If you don't mind, Mr. Chairman. General Myers, go right ahead.
But I would like to have the answer in writing as well, as I thought my office was promised.
Okay, I don't know about the promise, Congresswoman, but could you repeat the question to make sure I'm answering the right question? This is 9/11 question.
The question was, we had 4 war games going on September 11th, and the question that I tried to pose before the Secretary had to go to lunch was whether or not the activities of the 4 war games going on September 11th actually impaired our ability to respond to the attacks.
The answer to the question is no, did not impair our response. In fact, General Eberhart, who was then the commander of North American Aerospace Defense Command, as he testified in front of the 9/11 Commission, I believe he told them that it enhanced our ability to respond, given that NORAD didn't have the overall responsibility for responding to the attacks today. That was an FAA responsibility. But they were 2 CPXs. There was 1 Department of Justice exercise that didn't have anything to do with the other 3, and there was an actual operation ongoing because there was some Russian bomber activity up near Alaska. So
let me ask you this, then. Who was in charge of managing those war games?
And General, why don't you give the best answer you can here in a short period of time, and we'll the gentlelady wants to get a written answer anyway, and then we can move on
The
to
important
other
thing
folks.
to realize is North American Aerospace Defense Command was responsible. These are command post exercises. What that means is all the battle positions that are normally not filled are indeed filled. So it was an easy transition from an exercise into a real-world situation. It actually enhanced the response. Otherwise, it would take somewhere between 30 minutes and a couple of hours to fill those positions, those battle spaces, with the right staff officers.
Mr. Chairman, begging your indulgence, was September 11th declared a National Security Special Event Day?
I have to look back. I do not know. You mean after the fact or before?
No, because of the activities going on that had been scheduled at the United Nations that day.
I'd have to go back and check. Don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, thank the gentlelady. The chair would ask that
there are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we don't know.
It takes incredible conspiracies. Hundreds of people would have had to be involved. People would have had to be rubbed out without a trace. People would have had to blow up buildings without any evidence. Don't you see this as a bit paranoid? Okay. Say, Donald, did you ever find that $2.3 trillion that you talked about the day before 9/11? Did you ever find it?
It was always there, and what the problem was tracking it through the system. So when I arrived in the Pentagon, and they told me that they can't track $2.3 billion that had been accumulated over the period before I got there, it turns out that there was not a legal problem or a loss. It was a matter of the complexity of the systems and tracking it all the way through.
That's a major headlines on that morning. September 11th. Sorry. Made that speech. Trillions of dollars gone. And you can look up why we might think that there could be some illegitimacy to that situation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Inspector Coleman, you're the Inspector General for the Federal Reserve, right? Okay. That's correct. Have you done any investigations concerning the Federal Reserve's role in deciding not to save Lehman Brothers, which led to shockwaves that went through the entire financial system?
In that particular area, I don't generally comment on specific investigations, but we do not currently have an investigation in that particular area.
All right. What about the $1 trillion plus in expansion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet since last September? Have you conducted any investigations regarding that?
Right now we have we call it a review, and the term investigation, we have different connotations. So we're actually conducting a fairly high-level review of the various lending facilities collectively, which would include, the TALF, a variety of the different programs that are in process. So we're looking at them at a fairly high level to identify risk.
Well, I understand that, but we're talking about events that started unfolding 8 months ago. Have you reached any conclusions about the Fed expanding its balance sheet by over $1 trillion since last September?
We have not yet reached any conclusions.
Do you know who received that money?
We're in the process right now of doing our review, and
Right, but you're the Inspector General. My question specifically is, do you know who received that $1 trillion plus that the Fed extended and put on its balance sheet since last September? Do you know the identity of the recipients?
I do not know. We have not looked at that specific area at this particular point on those reviews.
What about Bloomberg's report that there are trillions of dollars in off-balance sheet transactions that the Federal Reserve has entered into since last September? Are you familiar with those off-balance sheet transactions?
I think it may be important at this point, too, just to bring up a certain aspect related to our jurisdiction. And just to clarify perhaps some of my earlier comments, we are the Inspector General for the Board of Governors, and we have direct oversight over board programs and operations, and are also able to look at board-delegated functions to the reserve banks, as well as the board's oversight and supervision of the reserve banks. We do not have jurisdiction to directly go out and audit reserve bank activities specifically. Nevertheless, in our lending facilities project, for example, we are looking at the board's oversight over the program, and to the extent that extends out to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Well, I have a copy of the Inspector General Act here in front of me. It says, among other things, that it's your responsibility to conduct and supervise audits and investigations related to the programs and operations of your agency.
That's correct.
So I'm asking you if your agency has, in fact, according to Bloomberg, extended $9 trillion in credit, which, by the way, works out to $30,000 for every single man, woman, and child in this country. I'd like to know, if you're not responsible for investigating that, who is?
We have responsibility for the Federal Reserve's programs and operations, to conduct audits and investigations in that area. In terms of who's responsible for investigating, would you mind repeating the question one more time?
What have you done to investigate the off-balance sheet transactions conducted by the Federal Reserve, which, according to Bloomberg, now total $9 trillion in the last 8 months?
I'll have to look specifically at that Bloomberg article. I don't know if I have actually seen that particular one.
That's not the point. The question is, have you done any investigation or auditing of off-balance sheet transactions conducted by the Federal Reserve?
At this point, we're conducting our lending facility project at a fairly high level and have not gotten to a specific level of detail to really be in a position to respond to your question.
Have you conducted any investigation or auditing of the losses that the Federal Reserve has experienced on its lending since last September?
We're still in the process of conducting that review. Until we actually, go out and gather the information, I'm not in a position to really respond to the specific question.
So are you telling me that nobody at the Federal Reserve is keeping track on a regular basis of the losses that it incurs on what is now a $2 trillion portfolio?
I don't know if you're telling me that you're mentioning that there's losses. I'm just saying that we're not. Until we actually look at the program and have the information, we're not in a position to say whether there are losses or to respond in any other way to that.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I have to tell you honestly, I am shocked to find out that nobody at the Federal Reserve, including the Inspector General, is keeping track of this.
Or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Here are the facts. The Federal Reserve is one of the most important institutions in the United States. Through the management of currency and interest rates, the Fed attempts to keep banks secure. Since 1913, the Federal Reserve has conducted business constitutionally assigned to Congress. That's a lot of responsibility. Why does the Fed have it? In 1910, a group of international bankers left New Jersey with Senator Nelson Aldrich in a train headed for Jekyll Island. This was a gutsy move on Aldrich's part. After the Panic of 1907, associating with Wall Street was political suicide. They called it a hunting trip, but the real purpose of the meeting was the formation of laws to govern U.S. currency. This was a tricky proposition. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states that Congress should coin U.S. money. Additionally, the Founding Fathers condemned central banking. At Jekyll, the bankers and Aldrich created the core of the Federal Reserve Act. In one fell swoop, this act created the Fed and put it under the President's approval rather than that of Congress. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was born despite opposition and controversy. Critics say that allowing bankers to write financial laws is a conflict of interest. On the other hand, who knows more about banks than bankers? Today, the Fed calls itself a decentralized banking system. It's composed of 12 banks, each serving a different part of the U.S. These 12 are composed of other member banks. The Fed is unique in the legal world. It isn't owned by the U.S., and its leaders aren't elected by U.S. citizens. Officially, the Fed is owned by these member banks, but what does that mean exactly? Here's where it gets crazy. Many people believe the Fed is more than a mild-mannered group of bankers. They say it might be part of a plan to take over the world. These sources think a group of banking families have undertaken a conspiracy spanning generations with the goal of creating a worldwide feudal society. This is not a surprising accusation. After all, international bankers are one of the conspiracy world's favorite boogeymen. The Rockefellers and Rothschilds have been accused of thousands of conspiracies, from stealing UFOs to heading satanic cults. When conspiracy theorists talk about the bankers as a group, they usually refer to them as members of the Illuminati. You've heard of this group before, the shadowy puppet masters allegedly responsible for everything from the Cold War to crack cocaine. But if this group is so powerful, then why would it need a bank? Theorists say that untraceable money is the key. This way, the group can support both sides of wars and engineer catastrophes like the Great Depression. Conspiracy theorists think the elites manipulate the economy toward a breaking point. Once the system breaks, the group will supposedly create a one-world government. They're allegedly banking on the idea that distressed people throughout the world will welcome any kind of authority. If the Fed is aware of its negative image, it hasn't done much to correct it. Consider the Fed's apparent immunity in U.S. courts. Precedents set in other cases, such as the ruling preventing the NRA from conducting a government function, apparently don't set precedents that apply to the Fed. So why is the media hesitant to examine the Federal Reserve or the laws surrounding it? Is it too boring for prime time? Or is something else going on behind the closed doors of America's moneymakers? Something that they don't want you to know.
The currency war is red hot at the moment, with weekly reports of China in particular fueling the rhetoric of ending the US dollar hegemony. Russia has also been very active at this talk, stating that they will be diversifying out of the US dollar and into safer investments. They have been partnering with China as the sanctions simply push them further away from the West. Slowly but surely, the BRICS are increasing in strength and the dollar begins to weaken. This monetary system is far overdue for a change. Let's get into the news right away. China is looking to dominate the gold market with International Shanghai Gold Exchange. This is huge news right now. I'll get into the highlighted portion where it says the People's Bank of China has been given the Shanghai Gold Exchange permission to begin to build an international gold trading platform in Shanghai. This news is absolutely massive when you think about it, where you have the largest gold producing and consuming nation, China, now able to have this international gold trading platform. That is massive. This is going to change the way the gold market is totally perceived, because you had that gold fix, the London gold fix, and they knew specifically that this was a fraud. The way that the numbers were being priced, just like the whole LIBOR scandal, they came together, they sit down, and they decide, what are we going to set the price at? And they just make it up. It's a fraud. So now, at least the rhetoric is there for them to be pricing their own gold and other things. Who knows down the road what they're planning on. So this article here is out of the NASDAQ. Russia to consider diversifying away from Western debt securities. Massive news once again. This is the currency war that is taking place, where the US dollar has the strength. It has all the money basically being funneled into it by its own consumers, by foreigners. And here we are right now, Russia considering diversifying its debt portfolio away from the countries that have imposed sanctions on Moscow. And that's the finance minister saying this. Is not just some analyst, not just me. That is the finance minister saying that nations like Australia, Canada, the EU, Japan, and the UK, the US, they've all put sanctions on Russia. And Russia's saying, you know what, why are we even dealing with you people? We have the countries like China and the other BRIC nations who we're good partners with. Let's deal with them instead. So let's move on very quickly. When I wrote about it in my book, you could see this. It's not just Russia and China. Even the Brazilian finance minister said that when the Fed started printing money to buy up its own treasuries, it said that they were, quote, engaging in a currency war. That's his words, the Brazilian finance minister. And even the Chinese premier a few years back said that the Fed's policy would result in financial instability and asset bubbles. And what has it done? It's exactly what it's done. Created these asset bubbles everywhere. Look at the stock market. But it hasn't changed one thing, and that is the super rich rush to buy Italian job, quote, style bars. And this right here, the economic uncertainties trigger a rush for the 12.5 kilo gold bars. Each of them are worth 300,000 pounds. This is huge. Big bars right there. So right here we have this news. The number of 12.5 kilo gold bars are being bought by the wealthy customers and has increased by 243% so far this year. That's big. The real rich want that security, want that safety. They want diversification as well. So they put their money in these big bars and they store them in vaults all around the world. And they're saying that the Italian job style bars, they're the big ones. The standard individual generally does not ever buy these type of things. So you know that the rich, those who are on the inside, are buying the big bars, and that's very telling information. This is out of the New York Times, and basically showing you the difference between the per capita GDP over the past couple decades. But then you look at the median household income, and there's a great disparity that has been growing ever since approximately the year 2000. You can see that for yourself. The household income hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, it's gone down over the past few years. But the GDP numbers do not correspond. That's what I'm trying to tell you right here, that they keep pushing this GDP number over and over and over again, but it has no reality when it comes down to the median household income. Big news. And that's a currency war on your own self, from your government to you. That's the way that works. This is the total market capitalization of the NYSE, all the way from 1925. So you can see this from the very beginning here. Look how it's practically in a straight line up. There's points where it goes down and so on and so forth. But you can see the market cap, it's been increasing. But look at that total market cap divided by the gross federal debt. And when you see those, things are much different at this point, because you can see it's gone nowhere. Speaking of debt, look at this right here. Debt needed to create $1 of GDP. You can see this for yourself. The reality of the situation is that they continuously have to go into more and more debt in order to prop everything up. The GDP goes up when they go into more debt. Also, this is a factor with the whole Federal Reserve. You look at their assets, you look at their balance sheet, so-called assets. Their balance sheet is increasing directly proportional to the stock market's increase. As soon as they stop printing the money, if they ever do, they may do it behind the scenes, and they raise interest rates, you're going to have a crash in the economy. The economy cannot stand without the Fed. That's just the way it is. This right here is going to show you the fragility of this market. Where there is risk, there's fragility. Where there's fragility, there's going to be a crash and a crisis. These are hundreds of different stocks that basically this is on the 19th, showing you right at 350. They just go wild. These are the algorithms. These are your totally fraudulent markets that have no basis on reality. And here they are, people are investing, they're putting their whole life savings into it, they're putting their whole career into it, and they're trying to show you that, hey, it's all fine, they'll take care of it. Whenever there's a bad scenario, don't worry, if there's anything with my bank, the FDIC will take care of it. I have insurance, don't worry about it. And in the worst case scenario, the Federal Reserve will just step in and pump up all this money. But the fact remains is that these markets are all fake, they're all fraudulent. Look at the algorithms, look at these computer algorithms that are just designed to screw everything up. Look at this is crazy. And anyway, I've ranted enough in this video. The currency war is on, and I hope that you take that very seriously. If you found this video informative, please give me a thumbs up, and don't forget to become an insider. The Insiders is where I give out all my best intel for free, and that's available at themoneygps.com. You scroll down to the bottom, you fill in your email address, and you get occasional emails from me with good, short, concise info.
Спасибо большое, уважаемая госпожа федеральный канцлер, господин Тельчик, дамы и господа. Весьма признателен за приглашение на столь представительную конференцию, собравшую политиков, военных, предпринимателей, экспертов из более чем 40 стран мира. Формат конференции дает мне возможность избежать излишнего политеса и необходимости говорить округлыми, приятными, но пустыми дипломатическими штампами. Формат конференции позволяет сказать то, что я действительно думаю о проблемах международной безопасности. И если мои рассуждения покажутся нашим коллегам излишне полемически заостренными, либо неточными, я прошу на меня не сердиться. Это ведь только конференция. И надеюсь, что после 2-3 минут моего выступления господин Тельчик не включит там красный свет. Итак, известно, что проблематика международной безопасности много шире вопросов военно-политической стабильности. Это устойчивость мировой экономики, преодоление бедности, экономическая безопасность и развитие межцивилизационного диалога. Такой всеобъемлющий, неделимый характер безопасности выражен и в ее базовом принципе. Безопасность каждого – это безопасность всех. Как сказал еще в первые дни разгоравшейся Второй мировой войны Франклин Рузвельт, где бы ни был нарушен мир, мир повсюду оказывается в безопасности. и под угрозой. Эти слова продолжают сохранять актуальность и сегодня. Об этом, кстати, свидетельствует и тема нашей конференции, которая здесь вот написана «Глобальные кризисы, глобальная ответственность». Всего лишь 2 десятилетия назад мир был идеологически и экономически расколот, а его безопасность обеспечивали огромные стратегические потенциалы 2 сверхдержав. Глобальное противостояние отодвигало на периферию международных отношений и повестки дня крайне острые экономические и социальные вопросы. И как всякая война, война холодная оставила нам и не разорвавшиеся снаряды, образно выражаясь. Имею в виду идеологические стереотипы, двойные стандарты, иные шаблоны блокового мышления. Предлагавшийся же после холодной войны однополярный мир тоже не состоялся. История человечества, конечно, знает и периоды однополярного состояния, и стремления к мировому господству. Чего только не было в истории человечества. Однако, что же такое однополярный мир? Как бы ни украшали этот термин, он в конечном итоге означает на практике только одно. Это один центр власти, один центр силы, один центр принятия решения. Это мир одного хозяина, одного суверена. И это в конечном итоге губительно не только для всех, кто находится в рамках этой системы, но и для самого суверена, потому что разрушает его изнутри. И это ничего общего не имеет, конечно, с демократией. Потому что демократия — это, как известно, власть большинства при учете интересов и мнений меньшинства. Кстати говоря, Россию нас постоянно учат демократии. Но те, кто нас учат, сами почему-то учиться не очень хотят. Считаю, что для современного мира однополярная модель не только неприемлема, но и вообще невозможна. И не только потому, что при единоличном лидерстве в современном, именно в современном мире не будет хватать ни военно-политических, ни экономических ресурсов. Но, что еще важнее, сама модель является неработающей, так как в ее основе нет и не может быть морально-нравственной базы современной цивилизации. Вместе с тем, все, что происходит сегодня в мире, и сейчас мы только вот начали дискутировать об этом, это следствие попыток внедрения именно этой концепции в мировые дела, концепции однополярного мира. А какой результат? Односторонние, нелегитимные часто действия не решили ни одной проблемы. Более того, они стали генератором новых человеческих трагедий и очагов напряженности. Судите сами. Войн, локальных и региональных конфликтов меньше не стало. Господин Тельчик вот об этом очень мягко упомянул. И людей в этих конфликтах гибнет не меньше, а даже больше, чем раньше. Значительно больше. Значительно больше. Сегодня мы наблюдаем почти ничем не сдерживаемое, гипертрофированное применение силы в международных делах, военной силы. Силы, вергающие мир в пучину следующих один за другим конфликтов. В результате не хватает сил на комплексное решение ни одного из них. Становится невозможным и их политическое решение. Мы видим все большее пренебрежение основополагающими принципами международного права. Больше того, отдельные нормы, да по сути чуть ли не вся система права одного государства, прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов, перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится? Кому это понравится? В международных делах все чаще встречается стремление решить тот или иной вопрос, исходя из так называемой политической целесообразности, основанной на текущей политической конъюнктуре. И это, конечно, крайне опасно. И ведет к тому, что никто уже не чувствует себя в безопасности. Я хочу это подчеркнуть. Никто не чувствует себя в безопасности. Потому что никто не может спрятаться за международным правом, как за каменной стеной. Такая политика является, конечно, катализатором гонки вооружений. Доминирование фактора силы неизбежно подпитывает тягу ряда стран к обладанию оружием массового уничтожения. Больше того, появились принципиально новые угрозы, которые и раньше были известны, но сегодня приобретают глобальный характер, такие как терроризм. Убежден, мы подошли к тому рубежному моменту, когда должны серьезно задуматься над всей архитектурой глобальной безопасности. И здесь надо отталкиваться от поиска разумного баланса между интересами всех субъектов международного общения. Тем более сейчас, когда международный ландшафт столь ощутимо и столь быстро меняется. Меняется за счет динамичного развития целого ряда государств и регионов. Госпожа федеральный канцлер упомянул уже об этом. Так суммарный ВВП Индии и Китая по паритетной покупательной способности уже больше, чем у Соединенных Штатов Америки. А рассчитанный по тому же принципу ВВП государств группы БРИК, Бразилия, Россия, Индия, Китай, превосходит совокупный ВВП Евросоюза. И по оценкам экспертов, в обозримой исторической перспективе этот разрыв будет только возрастать. Не стоит сомневаться, что экономический потенциал новых центров мирового роста будет неизбежно конвертироваться в политическое влияние и укреплять будет многополярность. В этой связи серьезно возрастает роль многосторонней дипломатии. Открытость, транспарентность и предсказуемость политики безальтернативны. А применение силы должно быть действительно исключительной мерой. Так же, как и применение смертной казни в правовых системах некоторых государств. Сегодня же мы, наоборот, наблюдаем ситуацию, когда страны, в которых применение смертной казни запрещено даже в отношении убийц и других преступников, опасных преступников. Несмотря на это, такие страны легко идут на участие в военных операциях, которые трудно назвать легитимными. А ведь в этих конфликтах гибнут люди, сотни, тысячи мирных людей. Но в то же время возникает вопрос, разве мы должны безучастно и безвольно взирать на различные внутренние конфликты в отдельных странах, на действия авторитарных режимов, тиранов, на распространение оружия массового уничтожения? Именно, по сути, это и лежало в основе вопроса, который был задан федеральному канцлеру нашим уважаемым коллегой господином Либерманом.
Honestly tried to avoid a military confrontation with Russia over the Ukraine, because both countries have nuclear weapons. Any military confrontation will, of course, be disastrous. And, of course, I think he's also trying to avoid sending in weapons and ammunition to that, at least overtly, because the Russians seem to be doing that. But it's in their sphere of influence. Great powers usually respect each other's influence, and this era has been traditionally in the Russian sphere of influence. So I think you'll see probably continuing economic pressure, because I think the United States also feels that the weak point of Russia right now is their economy, because oil prices are down and they depend heavily on oil prices. And also, there are already existing Western sanctions against Russia for taking over Crimea, and it's sending forces, likely forces, into Ukraine.
Situation. You mentioned a so-called currency problem. I mean, do you see the day in the next 5 years where it's fully convertible and flexible?
Well, you're talking to a person who's quite old. If I'm around in 5 years, I'd like to think that that is the case. I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency, because the speculation and the complexity of currency has caused some of the irritation, not only among the trading nations, but among individuals. But it's not for me to say how it will happen, but I think everyone who knows how to deal with these situations is very cognizant of the problem it takes to get over it, and I think the RMB will become more convertible. But when it'll come, that is a matter for, obviously, the powers that be.
I want to just change tack slightly. Of course, China's seen, parts of Central China, seen the worst drought that they've had in many decades. Now, you've got this investment with your wife in Weather Central. How could that actually help out in terms of planning for things such as droughts?
Well, I think that, first of all, we have 25 broadcast clients currently in China, and we are the #1 provider of broadcast weather graphic solutions in the country. I mean, you had this downpour, I believe, in the last 24 hours, which has caused even people losing their lives, and situations like this. With the detail that we can put up through the technology that we give to the various weather stations, this makes people more aware of it. On the whole, it's a question of giving the opportunity. I mean, we have also launched an operation called My Weather, which gains access to the first truly personalized weather application for the web and mobile devices. You can go up on myweather.com, and you can find out within a kilometer of where you are what is going to happen to the weather. It also gives a 10-day forecast. I think we've got to be aware that we're living in a time, I'm not going to get into the subject, which is a huge subject of climate change, but we do have variations of all sorts around the world. Certainly in England we have very precarious weather. We've had a drought up until about 10 days ago. And I think it is important to realize that you can use technology, which is offered by myweather.com, to tell you and be aware of what might happen to you, especially among the farming community. Also, we are very interested in helping wind power, because it gives... Sorry?
Sir Evelyn, we're just running out of time, but I wanted to thank you for stepping into our offices there in Beijing. Thank you very much indeed, Sir Evelyn.
Well, I'm very honoured that you gave me the opportunity. And
It is a future
I thank you
of
very much.
9 billion people on the planet by the year 2050. Of the 3 billion extra that have been added to the planet, or will be added to the planet from the year 2000, about 100 million goes to the rich countries, and 2.9 billion goes to the developing countries. So come 2050, it's not 1 billion and 5 billion, it's 1.1 billion and 8 billion, or close to it. That is a huge change, dramatic change. The other consequential change is that the structure of the economy is being driven both by the population development and also by modern technology, which has allowed the conveyance of ideas and innovation to move to the developing world. And so the projections today are that that old 80-20 with which I grew up for decades will become 35-65. 35% for the billion one in the rich countries, and 65% for the people in the developing countries. That is turning the world on its head in terms of the world that I grew up in. China
China might become a larger economy than the United States a lot quicker than people think. Is that the case?
That's right. Nobody seems to have picked this up. The IMF dropped a bombshell sometime, I think, in the last week, very quietly on their website, and no one seems to have picked this up. They have now put out a forecast of when the Chinese economy will overtake that of the United States. When you talk to a lot of Wall Street economists and talking heads, they will tell you, oh, it's decades away and all that stuff. Nonsense. It is 5 years' time, 2016.
But it is the world that you're going to work in. And it is not a trivial change. It is a change of monumental importance. So much so that by 2050, China and India, the two countries that I have, of course, the leading countries in the developing world, will constitute 50% of the global GDP. 50% of the global GDP. That is the consensus estimate. But let's say we're off 5%, it's 45% of the global GDP. It's nonetheless a monumental switch in terms of economic.
Just how rich and powerful is Lord Evelyn Rothschild? Historically, the Rothschild family wealth was hidden in underground vaults. The Rothschild secret financial records were never audited and never accounted for. Their family commissioned biographies give the illusion that their family fortune has dwindled, but researchers estimate their wealth at close to $500 trillion, more than half the wealth of the entire world. Besides their many castles, palace mansions, wineries, racehorses, and exotic resorts, the Rothschilds bought Reuters in the 1800s. Reuters then bought the Associated Press, which selects and delivers the same news stories to the entire world, day after day. They have controlling interest in 3 major television networks and easily avoid media attention since they own it. Until recently, they owned and operated England's Royal Mint and continue to be the gold agent for the Bank of England, which they also direct. They control the LBMA, London Bullion Market Association, where 30 to 42 million ounces of gold worth over $11 billion are traded daily. The Rothschilds earn millions weekly just on transaction fees alone. They also fix the world price of gold on a daily basis and profit from its ups and downs. Over the centuries, the Rothschilds have amassed trillions of dollars worth of gold bullion in their subterranean vaults and have cornered the world's gold supply. They own controlling interest in the world's largest oil company, Royal Dutch Shell. They operate phony charities and offshore banking services where the wealth of the black nobility and the Vatican is hidden in secret accounts at Rothschild Swiss banks, trusts, and holding companies. Although Evelyn Rothschild looks like a harmless gray-haired old man, make no mistake about it, Rothschild and his ancestors have handpicked presidents, crashed stock markets, bankrupted nations, orchestrated wars, and sponsored the mass murder and impoverishment of millions. The wealth hoarded by this one family alone could feed, clothe, and shelter every human being on Earth. How did Evelyn Rothschild become the filthy rich Grand Vizier to Queen Elizabeth II and godfather of the black nobility? By birth, Evelyn Rothschild is the great-great-great-grandson of Mayer Rothschild and is passing the godfathership down to David de Rothschild.
Recently, till we had this crisis, the United States had a sort of 10 trillion consumption, European Union had 9, and Asia and the rest of the developing world had a little less than $5 trillion. So it was 10, 9, 5. And the middle class in the world, of whom there are today, or a couple of years ago, was 1.5 billion roughly in the middle class. 1 billion was in the rich countries in that group that I spoke of, and about $500 million in the middle class, characterized as incomes of between $10 and $100 per capita per week. That this amount of money was demonstrated to be heavily leveraged to those richer countries. By 2030, the estimate now is that there will be 3 billion people in the middle class, and of that 3 billion, 2/3 of it will be in Asia. 2/3 of it. So this is a switch from being a fraction, being less than 1/3, to being 2/3. And that is a pretty dramatic shift. You'll have a middle class in China of 1 billion people. 1 billion people by 2050. Middle class. So these are not trivial changes in the outlook. These are tectonic shifts in terms of the way the planet works. And as I said to you, as I look at all of you, in my generation, we didn't have to think about that. In the Dean's generation, it was 80-20, or 78-22 or something like that. It was a balance where you knew you were the rich countries, the powerful countries, and all the organs of running the world were designed to accommodate that fact. There was established decades ago a 0.7 target for foreign aid. My former colleague from this activity who was here from a different part of Stanford, as I understand, knows this. And we're now, really, after a lot of speeches and a lot of activity, we're starting to get some momentum before the economic crisis of 15 months ago, which we're now maybe getting out of, to a degree. But it's now not at 0.7, it's about 0.2 that we've reached. And there are a lot of statements that are still being made, but in terms of the actual money which is flowing, if you X out the amount of money that are going to the trouble spots in the world today, there is very, very little development. And in fact, the per capita contributions to Africa have been declining steadily for the last 10 or 15 years. So what is interesting is to see how the dynamic between Africa and China and Africa and India is developing. 3 years ago, for the first time, the summit meetings of the African leaders was held in Beijing. And they swore after that that it was unlikely that they would ever meet again in a Western country. Simultaneously, 400 African businessmen met in New Delhi. And each led to an understanding on the part of both the Chinese and the Indians of having a dimension of their activities geared towards Africa. Of course, there's been an Indian community in Africa, particularly in East Africa, for a long time, and there are now 750,000 Chinese in Africa. And if you're in the business that I'm in, I was raise that as a point. And the second point I would make is that in terms of China and India, in terms of their development, I was trying to get the most recent numbers, and they may be in my BlackBerry, but I haven't looked. But the numbers in 2007 were the following. There were 110,000 Chinese studying in the United States. There are now over 100,000 Indians studying in the United States. So I look around the room, I suppose it's not surprising. There were 11,200 Americans studying in China and 2,800 studying in India. This is madness. It's just madness. And it's a tragedy in terms of the potential for our young people that are still being guided to look towards Europe, to look towards graduate work in British or European universities, when the world is telling them that the dimensions have changed notably. What is the last thing that I'll touch on, which is that historically, the Western countries were able to stay ahead, firstly, because of manufacturing. Well, that got taken out, and manufacturing moved to Asia. The second thing that happened after that was that in service industries, it moved to the Western countries. And now that's been taken out in terms of Asian really dominance in the service areas. And thirdly was in technology. We were able to stay ahead. But as is evident to you, and I'm sure from your colleagues and people you know, the technological advance has now shifted as well. So the challenge for our country is, what the hell is it that's going to be left for us if Asia's eating our lunch and dinner in terms of the things that we used to be able to do? And it's not just the United States. It is truly that group of the so-called billion plus that were previously the dominant factor who had 80% of the world's GDP. And so I leave you with that issue because as people that are going out into the world, if it were me today, the number one thing that I would be thinking about, which is different from when I grew up, is that the 80-20 rule, which I had comfortably in my hip pocket, is going to be a 35-65 rule. And that puts a challenge of dramatic proportions to anybody who's at a business school today or graduating.
but all police leaving the capital has been canceled. They're taking no chances. After last week's anti-globalization protests in Quebec, and the street wars on this spot during the same meeting last year of the IMF and World Bank.
Mr. Wilkinson, the protesters say that you are the chief of a secretive, undemocratic world government, which has actually made poverty worse worldwide. How do you respond?
Well, I think it's nonsense. I've been accused of things, but I didn't know that was one of the accusations. I'm not sure where this government exists. But if I can answer more seriously the question, which I think what is behind it, is that I'm very proud, actually, of the record of the bank.
12 of the 15 EU members issued the euro. The 12 member states that adopted the euro in 2002 were Austria, Belgium, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Portugal and Spain. The 3 members that did not adopt the euro in 2002 were Denmark, Sweden and the United Kingdom. Although not part of the EU, in 2002 Monaco, San Marino and Vatican City were allowed to issue their own euro coins. In 2004, 10 new countries joined the EU. They were Czech Republic, Estonia, Cyprus, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Malta, Poland, Slovakia and Slovenia. In 2007, Bulgaria and Romania also joined the EU. Slovenia, who had joined the EU in 2004, proceeded to introduce the euro in 2007. The following year, Cyprus and Malta introduced the euro. As of 2008, there are 27 members. 15 members have the euro. 3 states issued the euro but are not members of the EU.
For 300 million Europeans, from grocery shoppers in France to bankers in Germany, today was the first workday for their new common currency, the euro. Consumers across Europe appeared to be taking the changeover in stride. Many made their daily purchases today using the new currency. Others took advantage of the up to 2-month grace period, when most businesses will also accept the old currencies and give change in euros. As expected, banks and automatic teller machines were busier than usual, with many customers lining up to exchange their old notes for the new pastel euros with shiny holograms. I think it's going to be okay in a couple of days when you get used to it. But right now, it's very difficult. There were a few glitches.
Do not accept credit cards.
Tourists and commuters paying in euros for the first time created long lines at popular attractions in Italy and caused toll booths to bog down in Greece. A young Greek woman expressed the ambivalence many Europeans feel about giving up their historic currencies.
So I think it's best for us because we're a small country. Now it's an opportunity to be a part of Europe more with strength and all this. Of course, we love drachma and we're very emotional for letting it go. But I think it's going to be okay for all of us.
12 of the 15 countries that make up the European Union agreed to retire their currencies. Austria, Belgium, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. 3 EU countries, Britain, Sweden, and Denmark, chose not to make the switch for now. The decision to unite Europe with a single currency came 10 years ago, when EU leaders signed the Maastricht Treaty in Holland. 3 years ago, governments and businesses began using the currency for accounting in electronic transactions. Initially, the euro was worth about $1.18, but has declined in value to about 90 cents. This week's January 1 transition to euro bills and coins amounts to the biggest currency transaction in history.
You don't have to change any money anymore, so that will be much easier to live.
For the nearly $600 billion worth of euros needed to replace all those national currencies, the European Central Bank printed more than 15 billion euro banknotes and minted some 52 billion coins. Head of Russia's presidential administration, it's great to have you with us, sir, today.
Thank you. Good evening.
So, Russia is among other countries that will help European Union through IMF. Do you think such ongoing financial injections will actually prove effective, and how long is Russia actually willing to help bail out countries in debt? Need.
Well, as for Russia's help, it's limited, of course, and we are interested in Eurozone staying stable because, as President Putin has already mentioned, 40% of all our currency reserves are in euros. We are interested in not only financially stable Eurozone, I would like to stress that point, but that European Parliament, European leaders, basically, of course, Germany and France, take responsible decisions curing the roots of the crisis. Not pouring money to stop it for a short term, but fighting the roots. I think in fact, it's none of my business, but I think the European Union has to impose a more stricter policy on debt, on unemployment, and on credits, because even the external debt is huge. For example, Russia's external debt is 9% GDP. In some of the European countries, in Eurozone, it's more than 100%.
You know, many say that Russia actually researched out of the global financial crisis better than other European countries. What kind of advantage does it give us now?
The huge market potential development, I would put it that way. Many people say that we have a blessing of oil and gas or natural resources. My private opinion, it's not a blessing, it's a curse. Because that blessing doesn't motivate you to diversify.
What makes you so sure that you will make the break now? It's been taking so long.
Well, diversifying a huge economy, such as Russia's, it would never take you a couple of years only. You shouldn't expect miracles. That it is in Russia now. I lived in Africa, so I know what I'm talking about.
Mr. Ionov, I would like to go back just a little bit about the oil dependency. I mean, as of today, Russia is still largely dependent on oil revenues. You know, some say that due to the lack of the global growth, we may experience a drastic fall in oil prices. What happens to Russia's budget if, let's say, oil prices fall down $100 mark? Do you have a plan B?
We do.
Tell me about it.
It's very simple. First of all, we already have some experience after the previous crisis, 2008-2009. Secondly, our foreign currency reserves are third biggest in the world. They're $512 billion. Then we have a National Reserve Fund and we have Future Generations Fund. Combined, it's close to $1 trillion. So we have some money in case the bad case scenario happens. But of course, we have also, how we call it, state subsidies system, which we have tried and proved effective 2 years ago. Though, I wouldn't like to be over-optimistic and promise you that we are totally ready. First of all, there are so many uncertainties that it's impossible to calculate the implications, for example, of a huge oil price drop or some real big crisis in Eurozone. There are too many unknowns.
But also, the last months, they've been very notable for currency fluctuation, and that has made a lot of people nervous. I mean, we have the head of Russia's central bank come out and say, don't worry, this has already happened to the ruble before, but many people don't think it's a...
That's a good example, by the way. That's a very good example. People, and this is a real barometer, people don't panic. They don't rush to banks. And the currency corridor, we call it a currency corridor, which is the central bank now, is fluctuating. It's much wider than it has been before, which is a very good sign.
But what about the foreign investors? Why should they still feel sure about the ruble at this point?
The basic reason is very simple. They believe already, and most of huge funds like, for example, BlackRock or Kuwaiti Fund, they believe that our policy is transparent, it's stable, it's very predictable. The Kuwaiti Fund, which is most respectable, oldest and trusted in the world, for the first time in its history, gave the Russian direct fund $500 million alone, saying that you can use this money for any project which you invest inside Russia.
Look, I've been here for 40 years. I came with my mother because the great painter Gika, her husband's house had been burnt down in Idra. We had the great good fortune to find this property, which was a ruin when we found it. And I think we've had nothing but happiness here, some of the happiest years of our lives. So yes, I continue to find it a heavenly place, and one which I enjoy coming to as much as I possibly can. One of the great treats of a lifetime. As we all know, Greece went through an extremely difficult period, as did the whole world, post-2008. But there's ground for optimism, I think, now. The Greek government was able to raise large sums of money just 2 weeks ago at a rather low rate of interest. The Greek banks have raised substantial capital. We, my interest, subscribed to the new issue of Alpha Bank. It was heavily oversubscribed. We received some shares. The shares went to a premium. They raised over €1 billion. That's quite an achievement, considerable achievement. So there are grounds for optimism. Now the money has to be well spent. And of course there's plenty to spend it on. I mean, the island needs a lot of infrastructure expenditure, whether it's roads, whether it's rubbish. So to make it a great destination, those infrastructure projects have to be carried out, but they can be. They can be. So I think we should be more optimistic than we have been for several years. I think we all feel that the government has really done well in very difficult circumstances. So I hope that in the forthcoming elections, that they'll be given the opportunity to carry on the good work which they've started out. So now I feel optimistic, but we would like surely a period of consistency and not too much change, although the reforms of institutions in Greece does need to carry on and to be rationalized. It's that classically difficult balance, isn't it, between we need tourism here, we need lots of people to come here. At the same time, we don't want the place overrun, so that the things which made Corfu the beautiful place that it is, the historic place that it is, are in any way undermined. So that's a very difficult balance, a very difficult circle to square. I think if you look at what's going on with the history of Corfu, I mean, this year is the 150th anniversary of the handing over of the Ionian Islands to Greece. They're being celebrated in a good way. If you look at the institutions, whether it's the museums, whether it's the forts, whether it's the historic sites, whether it's the archaeology, whether it's the music, whether it's the opera, whether it's even the academies, learning and scholarship, they're in pretty good shape, but always more can be done. And I think if one could get those into even better shape with more infrastructure spending on the basic things that people need, that the quality of tourism will be enhanced and will continue. So in the round, I'm quite optimistic, and in some ways the recession which brought to a halt this fever of building is not a bad thing for the country to have happen to it. The future of the EU in economic and political terms remains still in the balance, not just for Greece, but for everywhere. I mean, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have great difficulties with the present relationship with Europe and wish to renegotiate many of the terms and the expenses that belong to the European community. If you take Greece specifically, I'm not sure. It's a real problem to be integrated into the rest of Europe at a time of great economic stress. I mean, you've got here very high unemployment, and that induces social unrest. The kind of classical way of dealing with that problem, of course, is to devalue. That's impossible if you belong to the European community. So I think a change in that relationship with Europe for Greece and for many of the other countries will be needed. And the question is, will the reforms take place from within Europe? And if they don't, then there's a risk that the community in its present form will break up. It's all to play for.
I grew up in a world in which, for decades, there was 1/6 of the world by the year 2000, 1 billion people, who had 80% of the world's income. And then there were 5 billion people who were in the so-called developing world that had 20% of the global income. So much so that as we look out, the so-called 80-20 that I and my contemporaries grew up with is now looking at a very, very different future. It is the future that you will face.
Joining us now in another CNBC exclusive to share his thoughts on the international financial system, what's right, what needs to change, Sir Evelyn D. Rothschild. Evelyn, nice to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, I read your op-ed and I thought it was so apropos in this period, and you went through all of the people who are to blame for what has gone on, and this is a broad group. Can you take us through your observations, given the fact that we've seen this global situation? Of course, Gordon Brown in Britain was very quick to take a stand and try and offer solutions.
Well, I think hindsight, as some people say, is an exact science. I don't believe that there's time talking to you to go through the past. I think what I'm interested in how we deal with the present and go for the future. And I think that, if I may say so, I think the Group of 20 meeting was very important because it brought out the realization that we're all in this together. And I think Gordon Brown did a remarkable job in pointing out that you have to have action, and the action needed to be taken very quickly. But, you know, politicians will debate, and they will debate, but I think that we have some very important principles if capitalism is going to continue for the benefit of all.
A lot of people are worried that, in fact, capitalism right now is being threatened. You've got the government in the United States owning 80% of AIG, owning Freddie and Fannie, in nationalizing those companies, and, of course, investing, taking stakes in the major banks. Is this something that you're concerned with?
Well, I think that you had to face up to the fact that you couldn't let these people collapse, and you've now got to realize that you've got to get the better system going. And here is one of my main thrusts, and I think regulation
is important. What has happened in the past is that you haven't had the regulation supervised. You know, it's very easy to have regulation, but you've got to have the supervisors. Two things. One, they have to know what they're supervising and understand what they're supervising, and they have to have the chance to have action when they decide that so-and-so or an institution isn't behaving correctly.
So in that vein, do you think then that it's a positive that they're looking for an auto czar, a car czar, to sort of police things once the autos get the money?
Well, I think that's a form of supervision. And I'm amazed that in your country, or here in the great US of A, you haven't put more supervision into the institutions where you put your money. We in England, the banks, have been very much taken over by the government in some measure or another. The chairman have been removed, the chief executive has been removed, and they are watching very closely how they behave.
Isn't it interesting that you saw the government come in and rescue Citigroup, and yet the management and board of directors remains in place?
Well, maybe that's a reason for that, which I wouldn't know. But I think what is important is that we've got to go ahead for the future and for the next generation and the generation after it. Capitalism is going to become a very important factor in our lives. You've got to make sure that people understand, first of all, that directors are well versed in what they are dealing with. I'm ashamed to say that I think a lot of people in the banking community, which I was some time ago involved, and I gave up banking 4 years ago, but I think that the important thing was for directors to understand, and the people working in the banks, what they were doing. I mean, this gearing that went on in the banks, this extraordinary measure of financial acumen which was used without people understanding.
So let me ask you this, as an investor, you know, I mean, clearly your family business over the years, as you say, generation to generation to generation, has proven successful throughout all of those generations. As an investor today, faced with all of this upheaval that we're seeing globally, how are you investing? How do you see the marketplace today with the fundamentals clearly deteriorating around the world and the global markets in disarray?
Well, in 2007, I took the view that this is going to get very bad. And I personally, I'm telling you, I'm invested in government bonds. And I'm very pessimistic for the moment until we see what's going to happen next year. But I think that it's very easy to point out how you're placed in investment at the moment when you have lost a great deal of money. Where do you go from here? And I feel sorry for, which we don't talk about a lot, is what's going to happen with the pensioners. Especially in my country, they're in trouble. I believe they're in trouble here. You have a name for the pensions. And we have to face up to the fact that there are a lot of people who have lost all their savings and who are going to be faced with a terrible problem of feeding their family, dealing with the problems of day-to-day living. And I think that is where the problem is going to be the greatest.
You're talking about pensions as well as 401k plans. I think that's what you were referring to. And some companies now are deciding they don't want to match the 401k money anymore for individuals, making it that tougher. So what signs, as an investor who actually saw something negative happening a year ago and really did, you know, save your own personal money and certainly the family, what are you going to look at, red flags, that give you a sense that perhaps we've gotten through the worst?
Well, we haven't to know whether we've gotten through the worst, as you put it. I think what one's got to look at is you've got to look at very sound investments. And you've got to look at companies and organizations that have really not done some of the stupidities that have been done in the past. And you've got to really understand the management. I think you go back to basics. You know, one was brought up to believe that one didn't have huge overdrafts, that banks were not geared at 70, 80, 90 times, which some of them were, and that in the case of investment, you look at things that are worth investing in. Obviously the market will depend on whether it goes up and down with the attitude of the people concerned. But I mean, if you take raw materials at the moment, I mean, how much further down will oil go, for example? On the other hand, if you're very safety conscious, you hang on to your gold bars.
And of course, with oil having dropped the way it has, you're seeing those oil-rich nations who were, frankly, the money players around the world, whether it's the Russians or the Middle Easterners buying everything from real estate to yachts and cars. They have been quieted quite a bit. What can you tell us about the environment in the UK, the environment around the world, really? You're traveling all over the world in terms of the economic fundamentals today relative to the United States.
Well, I think it's very difficult to say it around the world. I mean, each country has its own problems. There are those countries that were very hit by inflation and have had to control it. Those countries which have problems with the workforce. And so you've got to look at each one. In the UK, where unfortunately at the moment we're getting more people going out of work, unemployment is increasing. We're going to have to find ways of helping those that are less well off. We have the housing problem like yourself. It's not, obviously we're a smaller economy, and it's going to have to be very difficult to convince people to reinvest because money is going to be short. So small businesses, which is the key. Let's face it, the world is made up of small to medium-sized businesses. I believe in this country it's a huge number of small and medium-sized businesses that make up the backbone of the United States. I mean, you're talking about the auto industry. It's the suppliers to the auto industry that in some ways are more important than the big manufacturers.
Right.
Which is part of the reason I think that, the government felt that it couldn't go down. Final question here, do you have optimism that once we get through this, that perhaps the global financial system will be stronger, given the change in focus, more regulation, as you put it, more supervision? And what about the unions? You look at throughout Europe, you've got unionization. We may see more of that in the United States. Has that hurt business or helped it?
Well, I couldn't judge on the United States. We had a wonderful Prime Minister called Mrs. Thatcher, who put the unions in the correct measure of what they're doing. And on the whole, the relationship in the United Kingdom with the unions is very good. But that's a challenge for each country with its own problems. But I think what we've got to face up to is it's not just regulation. We've got to go back to basics and teach bankers and investment people, whether it's in hedge funds or whatever exists, that they've got to work within a prescribed limit. They can't just do what they want. What we've had for the last 10 to 15 years is unlimited attitude. We can make money, we can do anything we like, we just have tons of time to do what we want without regarding the regulation or regarding the basics of how you run your business.
Evelyn, good to have you on the program. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We so appreciate it. Sir Evelyn D. Rothschild joining us here at the NYC while you're traveling throughout the U.S. Thank you.
On Executive Order 11110, issued on June 4th, 1963. This is the order that Kennedy issued regarding silver certificates. And while I don't want to ruin the surprise if you haven't seen the episode yet, but for everybody wanting to know the Federal Reserve angle on the Kennedy assassination, please check out the video. Here are the facts. Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy are two of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. They were also both assassinated. Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1865, by an actor named John Wilkes Booth. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. While each of these tragic events altered the course of the nation, political assassinations are not an uncommon occurrence throughout the world. These deaths may be the inevitable result of a power shift, a coup d'etat, or scapegoating. But to some conspiracy theorists, the deaths of Lincoln and Kennedy aren't just disturbing, they are related. Here's where it gets crazy. Some conspiracy theorists believe that financial interest arranged for the assassination of these presidents. In Kennedy's case, they argue that he was murdered because of Executive Order 11110 from June 4, 1963, which authorized the U.S. Treasury to issue silver certificates and to coin standard silver dollars. To these conspiracists, the central issue here is that Kennedy was taking the power of creating cash from the Federal Reserve, which charges interest to the government when it issues currency. In Lincoln's case, David W. Balsinger and Charles E. Sellier Jr. argue that he was shot, at least partially, because of disagreements with international banking interest over the financing of the Civil War. Lincoln, allegedly rejecting the high interest rates set by the Bank of England and other financiers, worked with Congress to authorize the printing of greenbacks to pay for the war effort. Ultimately, according to these conspiracies, two U.S. presidents were killed for financial reasons as much as ideological differences. But could this actually be true? It is true that private financial entities have ousted world leaders in the past. In 1893, a group of businessmen and property owners banded together to create the Committee for Safety and overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy, eventually annexing the nation into the United States. Further examples may be seen in Guatemala and Honduras, where the United Fruit Company wielded deadly power with political and occasionally military support from the U.S. These countries were not annexed politically, but United Fruit used its influence to determine the country's leaders. In Economic Hitman, John Perkins claims that he was hired by the firm known as Chas T. Main to trap poor countries in debt, using underhanded methods to strong-arm these nations into privatizing resources and following the commands of the developed world. Yet undue corruption is not the same thing as assassination, and skeptics are also quick to point out several inconsistencies in these theories. In both cases, numerous factions wanted the president out of the picture. There is no solid proof connecting the issuance of greenbacks or Kennedy dollars to their assassinations. While it is true that questions remain regarding both murders, these events have become part of American folklore, and with time, increasingly exaggerated connections and coincidences are bound to be touted as fact. Is there a grain of truth somewhere in the theory? Given that 4 of the 44 U.S. presidents have been assassinated, the fatality rate seems surprisingly high. Yet political figures across the planet are inherently in dangerous positions, especially in times of domestic instability or financial upheaval. Assassinations, coup d'etat, and forced depositions are all too common in the turbulent world of international politics. And it's no secret that in the past, large private organizations have used their economic clout to change the state of a country's government. But does this still happen today? Skeptics maintain that the Kennedy and Lincoln assassinations, like those of most world leaders, were not orchestrated by any international banking cartel. The sheer level of organization and secrecy required would make the task impossible. But to conspiracy theorists, there's only one important question: who's next?
The current $1 bill monster. We have this is the San Francisco seal for the San Francisco Fed, and the L is the 12th letter in the alphabet. The San Francisco Fed is the 12th bank in the system. There's another seal on here, which is the seal of the Treasury. There's a shield, and this chevron has the original 13 stars, so 13 colonies. These scales represent justice. The key, obviously, a long-standing element of the Treasury seal is connoting the security associated with the department. These spikes around the Treasury seal, there are 50 of them, representing one for each state. So now we'll talk a little bit about the neck. The most prominent feature is the Great Seal of the United States. And a committee consisting of Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin was appointed. 3 committees later, and 6 years later, a design for the seal was submitted and approved. It's 78. And just the pyramid alone is interesting because you have at the base of the pyramid the Roman numerals for 1776, connoting the year of independence. And then you get 13 layers to this pyramid before it ends. The message here was that this was an incomplete pyramid and had a ways to go. The floating eye here is variously interpreted. Some people see the work of Freemasons in it. Some people just see this as the divine eye of providence. It's a debate for the ages. Annuit Sanctus, it translates literally to he has favored our undertakings. Novus Ordo Seclorum can be translated to the new order of the ages. Now we'll talk a little bit about this side of the Great Seal. The shield has got 13 stripes on it. There's 13 arrows. There are 13 leaves. There are the 13 stars floating above the eagle. Once again, a reference to the 13 colonies. And then E pluribus unum, we are one, held in the eagle's beak.
You probably see a dollar bill every day, but have you ever really looked at one? What does all that stuff even mean? Let's start with the easy stuff. This is George Washington. In case you've never heard of him, he's labeled. This particular picture of our first president comes from a never-finished portrait by Gilbert Stuart. Because of the engraving process, the image on the bill is reversed. The portrait is supported by bay laurel leaves, which are often used to represent status. You know, think ancient Greece. The leaves depicted here are still budding, possibly representing that the U.S. has yet to reach its full bloom. This is the Treasury seal, featuring a balance for justice, a key for trust, and a sash with 13 stars. Remember that number 13, it comes up again later. Over here are the signatures of the Treasurer of the United States and the Secretary of the Treasury. The series date tells you what year the design of that particular dollar originated, and this guy over here is the Federal Reserve seal. If you read the ring around the seal, you can see at which of the 12 Federal Reserve banks your bill was printed. If you don't like reading city names, you can also just look at the letter in the center. Each bank has its own unique letter. You'll pause this part if you're actually interested. You'll also notice that letter is the first character on your serial number. Alright, let's flip it over to the side which is officially considered the reverse or back side of the bill. In God We Trust was adopted as the official motto of the United States in 1956. Those 2 circles are the 2 halves of our national seal, and 1 is the number of dollars that the piece of paper is worth. This is our national bird holding our national shield. The shield looks like our flag, but it's missing the stars. That ribbon the eagle is trying to eat says E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of many one. The eagle is holding an olive branch and some arrows to represent that while we're down with peace, we are ready for war. At least he's looking at the olive branch, indicating that, you know, all things being equal, he would definitely prefer peace. The pyramid is probably the dollar bill's biggest WTF, so let's break it down piece by piece. Novus Ordo Seclorum sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but is actually a line from the ancient Roman poet Virgil, meaning a new order of the ages. Annuit Septis translates to he has favored our undertakings, and that's a he with a capital H if you know what I mean. The pyramid represents strength and durability, and at the foot of the pyramid are the Roman numerals for 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence. There are 13 levels of the pyramid representing the original 13 colonies. Those 13 colonies are represented all over the bill, including 13 arrows, 13 stars in the star thingy above the eagle's head, also known as the glory, 13 leaves on the olive branch, 13 pearls extending from either side of the seal, and there are more 13s if you squint your eyes and look real hard. For instance, both these lines have 13 letters if you count this thingy as one letter, which let's do because I don't know how to look it up. The floating eye is the eye of providence, a symbol that has been used throughout history to represent God watching over us. Some people, including those who saw the popular Nicolas Cage movie National Treasure, will tell you that the eye is the symbol of the Illuminati or the Freemasons and represents their influence in our government. But for this video, let's just stick to the facts. And the fact is, if you ask enough English majors, you can get an unfinished God pyramid on a barren landscape to represent anything. But then again, over here in the corner there appears to be an owl, so what do I know? All this symbolism on one little piece of paper. Did you ever notice any of it?
Have you ever wondered why countries can't just print more money to pay off their debts, or to feed the homeless, or to fix unemployment, or any other issue for that matter? Now this might seem like a rather silly question, but I think it's one of those questions that people might be too embarrassed to ask, but there's no shortage of people wondering. The short answer can be summed up in one word: inflation. Inflation is defined as a persistent substantial rise in the general level of prices related to an increase in the volume of money resulting in a loss of value of currency. But I'll get to that. First though, we need to establish exactly what money is. Now this may seem obvious, but something that you need to understand is that money has absolutely no intrinsic value. What that means is that money in itself has no actual value, it's only considered valuable because it can buy things. But if you were stranded on a desert island, money would be totally useless. Money only has value because we believe it has value. This is called the Tinkerbell effect, something I learned about from Vsauce. The Tinkerbell effect is used to describe something that only exists because we believe it exists. And this is the case with money. Hypothetically speaking, if people suddenly started to believe that money had no value, it wouldn't have value. Of course, it wasn't always this way. Money has been around for millennia, and when it was first used, it was in the form of commodity money. Things were traded that had actual value and uses, like salt, spices, horses, and weapons, as well as precious metals such as gold and silver, which technically don't have any intrinsic value either, but due to their rarity, they're almost universally accepted as currency. Then we have representative money. Since carrying around everything you own can be difficult, representative money makes more sense. Basically, you give your gold to a bank and they keep it safe for you, and in return they give you a piece of paper acknowledging that you own that gold. These pieces of paper can therefore be used as money, as anyone can go and redeem the gold at any time. But today, almost every country in the world uses fiat money. Fiat money requires faith and trust in the government that their money will have value. If we use a relatively young country as an example, the United States has gone through all three monetary systems within 200 years. In 1792, when the United States stopped using European money, the Coinage Act of 1972 brought the inception of the US dollar. The US dollar was originally in the form of commodity money in the form of gold, silver and copper coins. The coins were actually made from real gold, silver and copper, and the value of the metal that made the coins were exactly equal to their face value. The country then moved on to a mixture of commodity and representative money with the 1900 Gold Standard Act. The government issued dollar bills which could be exchanged for gold at any time. Gold standard is a type of representative money that many countries used at the time. This was an effective way to accurately calculate the exchange rate between countries. For example, if 1 gram of gold costs £1 in Britain and $1.50 in America, then you can easily deduce that £1 must equal $1.50. Gold coins were discontinued and the silver was removed from the other coins, effectively ending commodity money in the United States. In 1971, Richard Nixon officially abandoned the gold standard and the US moved on to fiat money. So today, money isn't backed by gold or anything else of value for that matter. So back to the question at hand. Basic economics tells us that an increase in supply results in fall in demand and therefore a fall in price. So the more money in the economy, the lower the value of each dollar, meaning other countries can purchase more dollars in exchange for their currency. A second supply and demand graph shows why this leads to a rise in prices. More money in the economy causes a shift in the demand curve for goods and services, but since this isn't matched by an increase in economic output, prices must rise. Look at it this way, if the government printed $1 million and posted it to everyone in the country, causing everyone to go out and buy a sports car, but there's only a finite number of sports cars in the country, so the logical thing to do is to increase the price of a sports car. If we use an analogy to demonstrate this, imagine there's 4 people on a desert island. They each have 10 pieces of fruit. All fruits are considered equal in value. Now imagine they discover a whole forest of apple trees. The nominal value of apples has increased because there's more of them, but the actual value of an apple has gone down due to an increase in supply. Therefore, it now costs 10 apples for 1 banana, since demand for apples is low but high for bananas. Just to clarify, in this analogy, the people represent different countries, the fruit their respective currency, and the apple tree is the printed money. But it's not just because of economic theory that we know printing too much money is a bad idea. There's several examples throughout recent history. The most recent example is Zimbabwe, who in 2008 suffered extremely high inflation due to printing money. This was the result of some awful decisions by President Mugabe. When the economy took a turn for the worst, Mugabe printed more money to pay government expenditure. This caused inflation to skyrocket, and in mid-November 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation peaked at... Actually wait, hold on a second. First I need to provide some context. Inflation in the United States is around 2%. Economists generally agree that inflation levels of 1 to 3% are optimum. First world countries' inflation rates today range from 0 to 5%. A country is said to enter hyperinflation when their inflation levels exceed 50%. So, with that in mind, Zimbabwe's inflation at its peak reached 6.5. 6,000,000,000%. Or to put it another way, that number has 22 digits. It got so bad that prices doubled every 24 hours. The government tried to solve the problem by printing more and more money with higher and higher denominations. They also kept knocking zeros off the end by revaluing the Zimbabwean dollar 3 times, going through 4 different currencies with 4 different ISO codes. Before the final redenomination, they were printing $100 trillion bills. People were literally using wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. The government even made inflation illegal at one point, and people were actually arrested for raising prices. In 2009, the Zimbabwean dollar was abandoned, and to this day they still have no national currency. Their people use currencies such as the US dollar, the pound sterling and the euro. Before the hyperinflation, the first Zimbabwean dollar was worth about $125 US. If that $100 trillion bill was worth that exchange rate, that single bill would be worth more money than there is in the entire world. Twice. But as ridiculous as this was, this is only considered to be the second worst inflation in history, after Hungary in 1946. Although Zimbabwe's inflation peaked in mid-November of 2008, their overall highest monthly inflation was 79.6 billion%, whereas Hungary's highest monthly inflation, which took place in July 1946, was 41.9 quadrillion%, with prices doubling every 15 hours. To put that into perspective, a country with a healthy inflation rate of around 3%, prices double every 23 years. Their currency was called the pengo, and as inflation rose, the bill pengo was introduced, short for billion pengo, which is actually 1 trillion pengo on the short scale. As well as the record for the highest monthly inflation, Hungary also holds the record for the highest denomination banknote ever issued, the 100 million bill pengo note, i.e. 100 million billion, which is 100 quintillion pengo on the short scale. 1 millard bill pengo notes were printed but never issued. In 1941, the exchange rate was about 5 pengo to $1 US. In 1946, when the currency was discontinued, things had gotten so out of hand that if you took every single banknote in the entire country, they would have a total value of 1/10 of a US penny. Hungary then switched to the forint, where 1 forint equaled 400 octillion pengo. That number has 29 zeros. So that's why governments can't just print money to pay off their debt. It does not end well. It's also important to understand exactly what national debt is. National debt is much more complicated than personal debt. It isn't simply a case of you owe people money. Take the country with the highest national debt, the United States, that currently has around $17 trillion of debt. And you're probably aware the country that holds most US debt is China. Although that is true, it's somewhat misleading. Of the total debt, China only has about 8%. Most of the debt is actually owned by the United States government itself, by organisations such as Social Security or the Federal Reserve. On top of this, a further 30% is owned by US citizens. And even though 8% of 17 trillion is still a lot, China can't just knock on the door of the White House and demand $1.2 trillion. It doesn't work like that. Basically, the US Department of the Treasury issued treasury bonds. You can buy these bonds and the government will pay you interest on that bond every year. Then, once the bonds have matured, they'll buy the treasury bond back from you. Now, if a country gets into financial trouble, it may have to default on its debt, which basically means you won't get your money back. But the US is generally considered an extremely risk-free investment because the US dollar is the most widely used and the most trustworthy currency in the world. It's even written into the Constitution that the United States cannot default on its debt. I'll leave you with this final thought, and what I think is possibly the best way to sum up why governments can't just print off unlimited amounts of money. If money grew on trees, it would be as valuable as leaves. Thanks for watching.
You are about to learn one of the biggest secrets in the history of the world. It's a secret that has huge effects for everyone who lives on this planet. Most people can feel deep down that something isn't quite right with the world economy, but few know what it is. Gone are the days where a family can survive on just one paycheck. Every day it seems things are more and more out of control, yet only 1 in a million understand why. You are about to discover the system that is ultimately responsible for most of the inequality in our world today. The powers that be do not want you to know about this, as this system is what has kept them at the top of the financial food chain for the last 100 years. Learning this will change your life because it'll change the choices that you make. If enough people learn it, it'll change the world because it'll change the system. For this is the biggest hidden secret of money. Never in human history have so many been plundered by so few, and it's all accomplished through this, the biggest scam in the history of mankind. They say that money doesn't grow on trees, but the truth is that the modern banking system creates currency far faster than trees can grow. Most people don't have a clue how currency is created. Economists and bankers make it sound so complex that people think they can't understand it. But I'm going to strip our monetary system down to its essence so that you can see the scam behind the curtain and just how it affects you. Every modern society creates currency in pretty much the same way. But since the US dollar is the majority of the world's currency, I'm going to use the United States as our example. It all starts when some politician says, "Vote for me and I'll make sure the government provides you more free stuff than my opponent will." But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So to provide that supposedly free stuff, the politicians vote for the country to spend more than its income. This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. So what's a bond? If you think about it, a bond is really nothing but a glorified IOU. It's a pretty piece of paper with numbers printed on it that says, "Loan me $1 trillion today, and I promise over a 10-year period I'm going to pay you back that $1 trillion plus interest." But what you need to understand is that Treasury bonds are our national debt. These glorified IOUs are to be paid back by you and I and our descendants through future taxation. Therefore, when the government issues a bond, it steals prosperity out of the future so that it can spend it today. The Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks show up and compete to buy part of our national debt and make a profit on it by earning interest. You'll notice that as we move through this process, the big banks are there, taking a cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't 1 penny in there. To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, "When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money." The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check? A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, "Here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up." Now, it's very, very important that you understand this process because we're going to come back later and show you the devastating effect this has on you. The Treasury issues IOUs, bonds. The banks then buy those IOUs with currency. The Federal Reserve then writes IOUs, checks, and hands them to the banks in exchange for the Treasury's IOUs, the bonds. And currency is created. So what's really happening is the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs, using the banks as middlemen, and abracadabra, presto, currency magically springs into existence. This process repeats and repeats over and over again, enriching the banks and indebting the public by raising the national debt. The end result is that there's a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury. This process is also where all paper currency comes from. The Federal Reserve and the government mistakenly call it base money because they didn't watch episode 1 of this series and they don't know the difference between money and currency. But I will correctly refer to it as base currency because it is not money. It is currency, and as we've learned, there is a big difference. Money has to be a store of value and maintain its purchasing power over long periods of time. We learned in episode 1 that earlier in our history, our paper currency was just a claim check. It was a representation for real money of intrinsic value, the gold and silver that was held on deposit at the Treasury. You could walk into any bank and slap your currency, like say a $20 bill, on the counter and redeem it for real money, a $20 gold piece. But now, this base currency that's piling up back here is really nothing but a receipt or a claim check on an IOU, that bond. So it's really nothing but a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the newly created currency into the various branches of the government, and the politicians say, hey, thanks for that, and the government does some deficit spending on public works, social programs, and war. The government employees, contractors, and soldiers then deposit their pay in the banks. Now this may come as a shock to you, but when you deposit your currency with the bank, you're not actually depositing it into an account to be safely held in trust for you. Instead, you're actually loaning the bank your currency, and within certain legal limits, they can do with it pretty much anything they please. This includes gambling in the stock market and loaning it out, at a profit, of course. Now this is where the machine of currency creation really gets cranking, because this is where something called fractional reserve lending comes into play. Fractional reserve lending is exactly what it says. The banks are allowed to reserve only a fraction of your deposit and loan the rest out. Although reserve ratios may vary, I'm going to use a 10% reserve ratio as our example. If you deposit $100 in your account, the bank can legally take $90 of it and loan it out without telling you. The bank must hold $10 of your deposit in reserve just in case you want some of it. These reserves are called vault cash. But why does your bank account still say you have $100 if the bank has stolen $90 of it? Because the bank left IOUs it created, called bank credit, in its place. Now I know this sounds crazy, but here it is in black and white from the Fed. Commercial banks create checkbook money when they grant a loan simply by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. These are nothing but numbers that the banks type into their computers. And even though these bank credit IOU numbers are very different from base currency numbers, because they only exist in computers, they are still currency. So now, there is $190 in existence. Now the reason people take out loans from the banks is to buy something. They're going to buy a house or a car or something like that. So the borrower takes the $90 that the bank loaned to him from your account, and he pays the seller of the item. But then the seller deposits that currency into his account, and his bank loans out 90% of that and leaves bank credit numbers in its place. So now there's $271 in existence. This process repeats and repeats until under a 10% reserve ratio, an initial deposit of just $100 can create up to $1,000 of bank credit, all backed by $100 of vault cash, just 10%. But as I said, reserve ratios vary wildly. On some deposits, it's 10%, on others, it's 3%, and on some forms of deposits, reserve requirements are 0. The result is that the expansion of the currency supply by the banks is far greater than even this example would lead you to believe. So once again, when currency is deposited in the banks get to lend it out, and then it gets redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent over and over again, creating bank credit all the way. This is where the vast majority of our currency supply comes from. In fact, 92 to 96% of all currency in existence is created, not by the government, but here in the banking system. Now, massive amounts of currency spewing into society may at first sound like a fun idea. That is, until you remember one of the most important hidden secrets of money from episode 1, that the prices of everyday goods and services act as a sponge on an expanding currency supply. The more currency we have, the more prices rise. This is where inflation comes from. The true definition of inflation is an expansion of the currency supply. Rising prices are merely the symptom. So our entire currency supply is nothing but a couple of bucks whipped up in this hocus-pocus scam where the Treasury and the Federal Reserve swap glorified IOUs, and a bunch of numbers that the banks just type into their computers. That's it. That's our entire currency supply. It's nothing but a supply of numbers. Some of them printed, most of them typed. And there is nothing else. But if you thought that was crazy, get ready to enter the twilight zone of modern economics. We work for some of that currency supply. True wealth is your time. But we trade away moments of our lives, hour by hour, day by day, and year by year, for numbers that somebody printed on pieces of paper or just typed into a computer. Now those numbers represent our blood, sweat, tears, labor, ideas, and talent. We are what gives the currency its value. But here comes the really cruel joke. We work hard so that we can save some of that currency, so that we can pay the tax collector in the United States, it's known as the IRS. They then turn it over to the Treasury so that the Treasury can pay the principal plus interest on that bond that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it. Now let's do a recap on this section because this is where the system begins to rob you and I on a massive scale. Much of our taxes are not used for schools, roads, and public services, but to pay interest on bonds that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it. The Federal Reserve is committing fraud. But here's one of the biggest secrets of them all. Before the establishment of the Federal Reserve, there was no need for personal income tax. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and that very same year, the Constitution was amended to allow income tax. Do you really think this was just a coincidence? Ask yourself how much income tax you've paid over your lifetime. Much of it has been silently siphoned away into the hands of those who own the system. Yes, this system has owners. Who they are is an even bigger secret that we'll get to shortly. But first, we need to understand the mumbo-jumbo of the so-called debt ceiling. It's all based on a huge paradox. There was interest due on that bond, and there was interest due on every one of those loans that the banks made. That means that there is interest due on every dollar in existence. Let me ask you something. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet, but you promise to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest, where do you get the second dollar to pay the interest? The answer is that you have to borrow that one into existence and promise to pay it back with interest as well. So now there are $2 in existence, but you owe 4, and so on and so on. The result is there's never enough currency to pay the debt. There is always more debt in the system than there is currency in existence to pay the debt. Therefore, the whole system is impossible. It is finite. It will come to an end one day. What would happen if the government stopped borrowing to do deficit spending? Are the payments on those treasury bonds going to stop? What would happen if the public stopped borrowing and going deeper into debt? Are your house and car payments going to stop? No. There is a payment due every month on the principal plus the interest on every dollar in existence, and those payments do not stop. If we stop borrowing, then no new currency is created to replace the currency that we used to make those payments. Whether you're making a payment on a loan or paying tax to make a payment on a bond, the portion of the payment that goes to pay off the principal extinguishes that portion of the debt. But the debt also extinguishes the currency. Currency and debt are like matter and antimatter. When they meet, they annihilate each other. If we just pay off the principal only on all the loans and bonds that exist, the entire currency supply just vanishes. So if we don't go deeper into debt every year, look what happens. The whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse under the weight of those payments. Politicians and pundits alike talk about balancing the budget, paying down the debt, and living within our means. They don't understand that that is deflationary. It is impossible to do under our current monetary system without collapsing the whole economy. This is why any talk of a debt ceiling is not only ridiculous, it's delusional. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt just to continue, and that's why politicians will always kick the can down the road and raise this so-called debt ceiling over and over again until the whole system finally collapses under its own weight. In other words, they don't want it to collapse on their watch. The founding fathers of the United States knew the dangers of central banking and fought to free themselves from this very thing. The Revolutionary War started out as a tax revolt, but now we must pay tax just to have a monetary system. Having just suffered through the hyperinflation of the continental dollar, which was printed into oblivion to finance the Revolutionary War, they understood the dangers of fiat currency and debt-based monetary systems. So to protect future generations from institutional theft and out-of-control government, they wrote into the Constitution that only gold and silver can be money for the simple fact that you can't print them. Our current system is not only unconstitutional, but it robs us of the liberty and prosperity our forefathers fought and died for. We are all feeling the effects of ignoring the Constitution right now. By forcing more currency into circulation, our purchasing power is diluted. Inflation is a slow and insidious stealth tax that is simply the result of this debt-based monetary system. This system empowers and benefits those who create the currency and receive it first, as they get to spend it into circulation before it has an effect on the economy. They're stealing purchasing power from you and transferring it to the banks and the government every hour of every day because of this false monetary system. And it's not like the people at the top don't know this. To quote the Federal Reserve, the decrease in purchasing power incurred by the holders of money due to inflation imparts gains to the issuers of money. This is a fraud. It is a pyramid scheme, it is a Ponzi scheme, it's a scam, and it's a lie. Our entire monetary system is nothing but a form of legalized theft. But here's the biggest con job of them all. The Federal Reserve is not federal, it has stockholders. There is no federal agency that has stockholders. What's a stockholder? A share of stock represents a percentage of ownership in a corporation. So the stockholders are the owners of that corporation. Therefore, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation with owners. And you can see it for yourself if you go to the Federal Reserve's website, and it will say, the stockholders receive an annual dividend of 6%. Now we know that the stock in the Federal Reserve was originally issued to the largest banks in the United States. But because of mergers and acquisitions through the years, you can't actually trace who owns the stock in the Federal Reserve. That's a very closely guarded secret. My guess would be that the owners are those primary dealers, the banks that get to make a profit by selling part of our national debt, those bonds, to the Federal Reserve, who buys them with a check from nothing. Then we pay tax to pay the principal and the interest on those bonds so that the Federal Reserve can pay the banks a 6% dividend. Don't be alarmed if you don't quite comprehend the deception of this system at first glance. Very few people do. It is purposely complex. The economist John Maynard Keynes once wrote, "By this means, government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft." I believe that presented correctly, anyone can understand this system, regardless of how complex it is. So let's do a recap and break it down even more. The way the system works is that, step 1, the government creates glorified IOUs. These bonds increase our national debt and put the public on the hook to pay it back. Step 2, IOUs are swapped to create currency. The Treasury sells the bonds to the banks. The banks then turn around and sell our national debt at a profit to the Federal Reserve, which they probably own. The Federal Reserve then opens its checkbook that doesn't have a penny in it and buys those IOUs with IOUs that it writes, checks, on a checking account that has a zero balance. Then they give those checks to the banks and currency just springs into existence, and then the whole process repeats. This results in a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury, which is really just a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the numbers in the various branches of the government, and we get to step 3. The government spends the numbers on promises, public works, social programs, and war. Then the government employees, contractors, and soldiers deposit their pay into the banks, and we get to step 4, where the banks multiply the numbers by magically inventing more IOUs through fractional reserve lending, where they steal a portion of everyone's deposit and lend it out. That currency gets redeposited, and then a portion is stolen again, and the process repeats over and over, magnifying the currency supply exponentially. Then we work for some of those numbers, which brings us to step 5, where our numbers are taxed. We pay tax to the IRS, who then turns our numbers over to the Treasury, so the Treasury can pay the principal plus the interest on bonds that were purchased by the Federal Reserve with a check from nothing. Then we get to step 6, the debt ceiling delusion. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt and will eventually collapse under its own weight because politicians always kick the can down the road. They don't want it to collapse on their watch. And finally, step 7, the secret owners take their cut. The world's largest banks own the Federal Reserve. Those banks make a profit selling our national debt to the Fed. They make a profit when the Fed pays them interest on the reserves held at the Fed, and the Fed pays them a 6% dividend on their ownership of the Fed. This system is fundamentally evil. It funnels wealth from the working population to the government and the banking sector. It is the cause of the artificial booms and busts of modern economies, and it causes great disparity of wealth between the rich and the working class. And it is only possible because we no longer use real money, we use currency. But worst of all, it is a form of enslavement. Bond is the root word of bondage. Whenever a government issues a bond, it is a promise to make us pay tax in the future. Nobody asked you if you wanted to pay tax today for the prosperity we all enjoyed in the last century. Nobody is asking our children if they want to work hard in the future to pay for the prosperity we're enjoying now. George Washington once wrote to James Madison, "No generation has the right to contract debts greater than can be paid off during the course of its own existence." By stealing prosperity from tomorrow so we can spend it today, we enslave ourselves and future generations. Now this all sounds pretty bad, but there is great hope, for you are the greatest threat to this false monetary system. This system relies on the public being ignorant of its workings. Please share this knowledge with everyone you know, because an informed public that fully understands the system can build a better future for generations to come. And now I leave you with this quote, widely attributed to a former director of the Bank of England. "The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money and control credit, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. But if you want to continue as the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create money and to control credit." This is the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. It's located on Constitution Street, and that is just as much of a joke as the New York Fed being located on Liberty Street. Both of them are unconstitutional, both of them limit our liberty, and they transfer wealth away from us every second of every day, to the Federal Reserve, to the government, and to the banking sector. You are now among the 1 in a million who can detect the theft of your prosperity. So the big question is, what can you do about it? 1. Watch this video until you can describe and teach it to others. Those who understand this system can make preparations for its unavoidable collapse and protect themselves. History shows that those who don't will probably be wiped out. 2. Share this video with everyone, especially those you care about. All it takes is a mouse click or two to get this message in front of millions. Post this video on Facebook, tweet it, email it to loved ones. Please share it wherever you can. 3. Join the conversation. The current world monetary system is based on a 300-year-old design meant to enrich a few at the expense of the many. There must be a better way. At hiddensecretsofmoney.com, we've created an open-source platform for the design and development of a new world monetary system. We're calling on every economist, every student, every college, every bright mind, and anyone who cares to join the discussion. In educating ourselves and each other, we can prevent the further loss of our freedoms and maybe, just maybe, win some of them back.
I think your episode 4 is very beneficial, very helpful. It's going to introduce these ideas to a lot of people, and like I've just been talking about, we have to change people's mind, and the more they understand it, the better. And I think we're at this point now where more people in the last several years, 4 or 5 years, have thought about the Fed than they ever have in the previous 95 years. So I think an explanation and diagrams to show it is very helpful because, quite frankly, they're not going to get it in their grade school, they're not going to get it in their high schools, they're not going to get it in college unless they're in a very rare circumstance to understand how this works.
You know, for years before I got involved in really studying gold and some of the things I write and talk about today, I was a monetary economist for decades. You know, in your video, you talk about the primary dealers. I was chief counsel and chief credit officer, one of the largest primary dealers for 10 years. So I had an inside seat on the Treasury market and had the privilege of working with several former vice chairmen of the Board of Governors, Manley Johnson and David Mullins, going back to the 80s and 90s. So I'm very immersed in what you were talking about. I thought it was extremely accurate, extremely clear. I didn't think you were stretching on any points. It was really like something out of a PhD course, except that it was very easy to understand. I think it's accessible. I think we're seeing a little bit of a revolution in communications in the following sense. You know, as you point out, the Fed was created in 1913. Well, in 1913, there was no web, there was no YouTube, no Twitter. There was really no one to kind of stand up and oppose the Fed, or call them out, if you will, or really get into a discussion that everyday Americans could follow. That's not true now with social media and everything else. You can reach out to millions and tens of millions of people and tell them what's going on. I think you've done that. You've done it successfully. I applaud it. I think this is a great video. I look forward to seeing it again. I know millions of people will enjoy it. Well, as we know, the Federal Reserve believes it can create money out of thin air, not realize money is supposed to represent real products and services. And what people don't realize is when the Fed does that, in effect, as Keynes pointed out, it's a form of taxation. It's a form of confiscation. And because people don't see it, the politicos get away with it, but it also undermines social trust. It just is corrosive throughout society. We're going to have a lot of turmoil in the coming years, but it's going to be the kind of turmoil that leads to positive things. So don't despair. Get out there and fight, because the tide is going to turn. This is going to be the status last stand.
Thank you. This episode of Mike Maloney's Hidden Secrets of Money was brought to you by GoldSilver.com and the new Silver Pegasus round. To learn how to protect your family and turn the coming economic storms into opportunity, visit GoldSilver.com.
Under this fractional reserve scheme, we inevitably become debt slaves to a ruling class of financial elite. Not because they are better or smarter than anyone else, but because they have rigged the system to benefit themselves at the expense of most people on the planet. Catherine Austin Fitts is an expert on this issue. She was an Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President George Bush Sr., and then an advisor to the Clinton administration.
Let's set up a game of Monopoly, and you want to buy Park Place. What I can continually do is just print money, give myself more money, lower the value of your money by printing more. No matter how hardworking you are or how successful you are, I can always end up buying you for free.
So how come if you or I make up money, it's called counterfeiting, but if the banks do it, it's increasing the money supply? How did the banks get this power? This is Jekyll Island, where in 1910, representatives from the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Morgans, and other private bankers gathered, secretly, to draft the legislation that would create the Federal Reserve. Ed Griffin literally wrote the book on what happened at Jekyll Island.
Central banks are banking cartels which have gone into partnership with the respective governments in the countries where they operate. And they've been given monopolistic power over the creation of the nation's money supply. That's what the politicians handed to them as a gift, you might say, for the partnership. Now, in return, what did the bankers do for the politicians? They promised to create money out of nothing, now that they've got this legal power to do it, anytime the government needs it.
And since 2008, we've witnessed the greatest fake money printing run in recorded history. This financial sleight of hand disguises the costs, hides who's to blame, and leaves us as debt slaves working to pay off the bill. I found it revealing that in the same year the Federal Reserve was founded, 1913, the Internal Revenue Service was also established. An income tax was then instigated so you and I would have to pay the politicians' debt, plus interest, to the bankers.
The problem is we have a privately owned central bank system in the United States disguised as a government-owned system. Now, if you look in the telephone book here in the Washington, D.C. area, you look up for Federal Reserve in the blue government pages, it's not there. It's in the white pages right next to Federal Express. It's a privately owned central bank.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. There is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
We have a private bank that prints money on behalf of the Treasury. The Federal Reserve prints money on a debt-based system which creates scarcity. But it puts a group of insiders in a position of having access to all the data about the economy when we don't. So you have a small group of bankers who understand the data on how the money works in the economy, and it gives them the ability to print money in a way that the insiders are protected and everybody else is drained.
Catherine went on to compare a healthy economy to a vibrant torus, balanced, freely flowing, and energized throughout, in contrast to what's happening in our current economy.
What you have is a system that's very dynamic, and it's trying to optimize. But intertwined in the core of it, you have a tapeworm. The way a tapeworm works in your body is it injects a chemical into your body that makes you crave what's good for the tapeworm and bad for you. You have a parasite that's very much manipulating and engorging itself at the expense of the whole.
We live in a tapeworm economy, where the financial elite are the tapeworm, and they're feeding on us. And they don't like it when people blow their cover. After Catherine began exposing government corruption at the highest levels, the FBI raided her company and seized its assets. She was dragged through the courts for 10 years before being found innocent. So we've got the Federal Reserve, a privately owned corporation with a monopoly on creating money, but with no accountability, backed up by a government with a monopoly on force. The country got sold on the Fed as an institution that would help stabilize the economy and remain independent of politics. But in fact, in close to a century of existence, the Federal Reserve has done just the opposite. Since they took charge, we've been robbed through inflation, and the purchasing power of the dollar has declined more than 96%. And the wealth gap makes it clear most of the money is going to a very few. Only 16 years after the Federal Reserve was in power, America experienced the Great Depression. My research revealed that before the big crash in 1929, the elite bankers pulled their money out of the stock market. After the crash, they used that money to buy up cheap stocks and smaller failing banks for pennies on the dollar. Among the bankers who consolidated their wealth this way were the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Morgans. A similar scenario played out in the 2008 financial collapse, with the same bankers benefiting. In the years leading up to the collapse, the biggest banks, including Bank of America, Citigroup, and Chase, controlled by the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Morgans, were bundling and trading bad loans that they knew would eventually fail. It's like putting rotten oranges in a box and selling them as grade AAA. The bundlers of the debt knew it was only a matter of time before someone would open that box and see that the content was worthless, since they were the ones who packed the boxes in the first place. When the rotten oranges, what we hear about as unsound loans, derivatives, and credit default swaps, were finally discovered, everyone was impacted. People lost their homes, their jobs, their businesses, and their retirements. Meanwhile, the biggest banks who created the problem in the first place were the ones who got bailed out. Why is that? Why would the Federal Reserve give trillions to the banks, even though the majority of Americans were against bailing them out? And why not help those most in need rather than the perpetrators of the financial collapse? My research led me to believe that the same people who created the Federal Reserve, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the Morgans, still control it, and they use this scheme to bail themselves out at our expense.
Many of the banks created are still the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill, and they, frankly, own the place.
I'm convinced that the near collapse of the economy in 2008 resulted from an orchestrated pump and dump scheme designed and executed by the big bankers to consolidate wealth and power. David Icke explains how he sees the Federal Reserve rigging the so-called business cycles.
Stage one, it's like throwing a fishing line out. Stage one, you put lots of money, units of exchange, into circulation. You do this by pushing interest rates down, by making lots of loans. This is the part of the cycle we call a boom. Because there's lots of units of exchange in circulation, there's lots of money changing hands. That generates lots of economic activity. That generates jobs. And as more and more money is spent, there's more demand. So companies take out more loans of fresh air money to increase their production. People get confident in their everyday lives. Hey, you know, I work for this company. They've got lots of orders. It's really going great. My job's safe. I tell you what, we can have a bigger house. Then they start to change it. What they do is they pull the fishing line in. They push interest rates up. Now, fewer people, are taking out loans, and they make the criteria for having a loan from the bank stronger anyway. And also, now, as interest rates have gone up, a larger part of people's income is going to pay back the extra interest and not being circulated in buying things. Suddenly, there's nothing like as much money in circulation, and therefore, fewer things are being bought. Companies start to go down in terms of their profits, they start to shed jobs, and they start to go out of business. People lose their jobs, they can't pay the mortgage anymore of the big house they took out in the good times. Now what the banks are doing is starting to reel the fishing line in, because as they go bankrupt, companies and individuals, the banks get the real wealth, the property, the land, the resources that they had signed to them for lending merely figures on a screen. Now this economic cycle of fishing line out, fishing line back, lots of units in circulation, pull them in, has been going on for centuries. And what it's done, it's stolen and accumulated the real wealth of the world in the hands of the few.
At the international level, central bankers use the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to make more money while exploiting the resources of countries they lend to, bankrupting them in the process. The central bank of central banks is the Rothschild-created Bank for International Settlements. The elite are positioning themselves to control access to virtually everything we need to survive.
No matter where you go in the world, the money is controlled by the banking system. They decide if people eat or if they don't eat. Who's a billionaire and who lives on less than $1 a day? He who controls the money controls the world, and a very few control the money.
At this point, my view of the world had been turned upside down. I was struggling with the realization that the failure and suffering of so many is actually success and fulfillment for a few. The elite central bankers who fooled the world into letting them create money. They already have vast fortunes, so what is their end game? What is their ultimate agenda?
Still no sight of them. I don't know what they're doing, but they only got 2 minutes left.
I mean, wars at one time were fought between armies. Soldiers killed soldiers. Now, and we heard tonight Dr. Gino Strada, the Italian war surgeon, tell us that the victims that he takes care of in the hospitals in Afghanistan and Iraq are 90% civilians, 30% of them children. In a situation like this, war cannot be accepted anymore as a way of solving any of the problems we have in the world.
Where do we get this concept of an idealized war?
Well, you know, we get it from the teaching of generations and nationalism and the idea that nations have that, you know, when they go to war for good reasons, for liberty, for democracy. And some of the wars better fit that description than others. You know, World War II better fit that description. The Civil War better fit that description, ending slavery. The Revolutionary War. But as I say, we've gone past that point where wars can be considered just. And many of the wars of the past, you know, wars like the war we fought in Cuba in 1898, the war against the Philippines at the turn of the century, the war in Vietnam, and the war against Panama, against Grenada, the first Gulf War, the bombing of Afghanistan. You know, wars have to be no longer categorized as just and unjust. War itself is unjust. In fact, we're so consumed now with fear of terrorism, justified, there is terrorism in the world, but it should be remembered that war is the greatest terrorism. There's no human damage done by bands of terrorists like Al-Qaeda that can possibly match the human damage done by governments possessed of enormous weaponry.
As a good citizen, do we have an obligation to go to war?
Our obligation is not to the government. Our obligation is to the principles that our country is supposed to stand for. The government is an artificial creation. This is what the Declaration of Independence says.
The Declaration of Independence says governments are set up by the people to achieve certain ends, an equal right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. When governments become destructive of those ends, that's the language of the Declaration of Independence, when governments become destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government. Obedience to government is the sign of a totalitarian state. Disobedience to government is a democratic act when that government is not fulfilling its obligation to care for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
When we wage war against another country, do we in turn become that which we seek to destroy?
I think we've seen that historically. Everybody. We've seen it just now. War has corrupted our soldiers, just ordinary guys. Their minds become poisoned by the atmosphere of war, and soon they are killing innocent people, soon they are torturing people. War is poisonous to everybody who engages in it.
Is it human nature to go to war?
The human beings fundamentally do not want war, and the proof that it's not in human nature is that governments have to go to enormous lengths to either seduce, propagandize, coerce their populations to go to war. No, fundamentally, instinctually, people do not want war.
We're using technology which many of you use in your daily lives. It's called Skype, and you know that the definition of technology is it's something that nearly works. So we'll see. Have we got Mr. Snowden? Hello, Edward. Hello, Edward.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can, but you sound a long way away.
Okay. I want to apologize in advance. It seems that we're having some kind of internet connection problem. I'm not sure what the issue is. Could be GCHQ, it could be, the Telegraph, but somebody doesn't really want us having a discussion today.
I would like to start with something that's of great interest to us here. When you've given interviews in the past, most of the discussion has been about the NSA and the United States. But what comes across in the documents that you released is an apparently close working relationship between the NSA and Britain's GCHQ. My friends in the computer security world sometimes refer to GCHQ as, quotes, the overseas franchise of the NSA, unquotes. But I'm wondering, is that an accurate characterization of the relationship? Is GCHQ really a bigger player than we think? Yeah, it is. One of the things we'd like, and I think you've been asked to do, is to provide some questions that you'd like to ask via Twitter, I think. I have some here already, for example. People want to know, does he have any hobbies?
I have to apologize. I cannot hear you at all. It sounds like you're on the Martian surface right now. Could you try to just your question, if you have it, in 2 or 3, maybe one sentence?
Okay. My question is GCHQ as big a player in this field as the documents appear to suggest?
Yes. The question that's come through to me is it a bigger player in sort of mass surveillance as the documents appear to suggest? And the answer to that is yes. We have an extraordinarily large, very secret, and unaccountable mass surveillance system in the United States. And that's when we have constitutional protections that prohibit even the passage of any laws that might enable those programs. Despite this, we have something extraordinary going on over there. Now in the United Kingdom, where you don't have the same constitutional limits on the sort of laws the Parliament can pass, what we've seen is the creation of a system of regulations where basically anything goes. The GCHQ and other British spy agencies can do anything they want. There are really no limits on their capabilities. What they do is they collect everything that might be interesting to them, which includes basically a 5-year backlog of all the activities of citizens in the United Kingdom. For example, through the collection of their metadata records, which is who they call, the locations that they travel, where their cell phones are associated with towers. Now, even that, even if you believe that is reasonable, which is in fact not reasonable because that's not how rights work, right? You don't have to say why you deserve privacy. You don't have to say, I need the right to privacy for this reason or for that reason. It's up to the government to justify its intrusions into your rights. You, as a citizen, never have to justify why you need a right, or it's not a right at all. It's something circumstantial. The GCHQ goes far further than the National Security Agency in the United States does, because they use unlawfully collected information to pursue basically criminal prosecutions, and they use this to share with other countries, where they will use intelligence powers, foreign intelligence powers, to gather information that's then used for law enforcement purposes. And this is very dangerous because when we think about the fact that evidence is being collected against us, but we don't have the opportunity to challenge it in courts, judges are not aware of where this information, where this evidence originated from, it undermines the system of laws and the system of justice upon which we all rely.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. The other side of this coin are the commercial companies like Google. Yesterday in an interview, you said some very hard things about companies like Google, Facebook, and I think Dropbox. Are you really seriously suggesting that people should avoid using services provided by these companies? Did you get that?
So the question as it's been sent to me is that yesterday I said some things about very popular internet services, Google, Facebook, Dropbox. Am I saying people should not use them at all? What I'm trying to say here is not that, these services are the worst thing on planet Earth. What I'm trying to say is that when we as consumers have an option between two services where one protects your privacy very strongly, it values it very highly, and another that is actually hostile to privacy, we should support the one that supports our rights, that encodes that into their policies and into their technologies. Privacy protecting alternatives, like a company named SpiderOak, which does precisely the same thing as Dropbox, they don't permit themselves that capability because they say if the government is going to label a warrant against you, it should go to you. It should go to the person who actually has control of this information, not a corporation that may not be able to bring the same challenges because they won't have standing to, as it is not their privacy that's being invaded. The people who should have warrants served against them should be the people who have an actual chance to challenge that in court. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Most people seem to be very relaxed about what the documents you released have revealed about the extent of GCHQ's operations and so on. If that is the case across the world, then surely nothing much is going to happen, even despite the revelations.
So I don't think it's necessarily true that because the public reacts less strongly in one jurisdiction than another, that there will be no change. When I initially came out about this and I was talking to other technologists and computer scientists about how we can fix this problem, there are broadly two tracks. The first is political. In our sort of national legislatures, we can push for reform, we can push for an increased respect for our rights, really not an increased respect, but a restoration of respect for rights that we've lost in sort of this terrorism era that we see going on, where we have this problem with public engagement. In the United States, uniformly, every newspaper across the country reported on this scandal, and they talked about why this needs to change, what kind of reforms we need to institute, and they debated where the line should be drawn. In the United Kingdom, we haven't seen that happen. We've only seen one newspaper, The Guardian, do that. All of the other newspapers, and I don't know why, whether this is a cultural thing, whether it's because they felt that they had been cut out of the story because they didn't have access to any, I guess, information sharing there. But they didn't cover it, or they covered it in a hostile way that I think did a disservice to the public. So political reform is a challenge in many places around the world, but that's normal. That's always been the state of the world. However, if there's even one part of the world, one region, it can be Germany, it can be the United States, it can be London, where we have a technical community that believes that this is a real problem, that believes that mass surveillance, the GCHQ's strategy of amassing a haystack of human lives and then sorting through it whenever they want to try and find needles, is contrary to the values that we as a society hold, they can institute protections on the technical that enforce our rights in a way that's not dependent on national laws. Because let's say in the United Kingdom we passed robust new reforms that prevented the infringement of citizens of the United Kingdom their rights by intelligence agencies operating in the UK. Well, that's not going to restrict the Chinese government, or governments in Latin America or the United States or Russia or Africa or any other region in the world, even France. If things are not encoded on a technical level, if they're not enforced on the level of systems rather than just words on a page, they're not really going to be meaningful when all of our systems are reliant on cross-border international communications. We need international solutions for global problems. I've had to make a lot of sacrifices. I risked my freedom. I lost my job. I lost my home. I haven't been able to relate to my family the way I once did. And I can't return to my home country, and that's a lot to give up. But My biggest fear when I did this was not what would happen to me. I didn't care what would happen to me because this is not about me. I was simply the mechanism of revelation. What matters is that in our times, in this post 9/11 period, in this post 7/7 period, we have seen the public increasingly lose rights again and again to a state structure, a security structure that's becoming increasingly empowered. At the same time, it's becoming increasingly secret. And so this brings questions that go beyond surveillance into what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where government can make decisions for the whole of society behind closed doors without accountability to public opinion or to our shared laws? And when the government unchains itself from any kind of restrictions, when the government says the ends justify the means, we have transitioned from the point of a democratic liberal society into one that is somewhat more authoritarian. And the question is this something that officials can determine on their own, or is that a decision for the public? And we can't make these decisions if we don't know about them. All democratic societies are founded on the principle that they're founded on the principle that the consent of the governed is from where all decisions, all governments draw their legitimacy. And consent is not meaningful if it's not informed. And I think that's the challenge that we saw last year, and that's why we've seen the strength of the response we have today. And ultimately, I think that's why things will change. We are transitioning out of the terror thing and moving to recognize that younger people today...
Are you surprised that we now know there's a second whistleblower? Have you started something that's going to roll?
So the question that I heard is, am I surprised that others have come forward? And I'm not. I actually think it was inevitable because people have called me, they've had this big debate, am I a hero, am I a traitor? First off, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether I am, the most wonderful person on earth or the most terrible. Whether I'm, loved by history or whether I disappear into a hole. That's okay. We should not say, this person is a hero. We should not praise the hero. We should praise the act, right? Because I'm an ordinary person in an extraordinary circumstance. This other individual, whoever they may be, it's extraordinarily courageous that after seeing the things that have come to whistleblowers who have come before in the United States, people who have been, they've had their lives destroyed, they've had their careers destroyed, they've been thrown in prison for 35 years, that this person would stand up and put their life on the line because they believe that they have a civic duty that they hold to more closely than they do to their self-interest. And that is something that I don't care who the individual is. I don't care whether they are the deepest, darkest criminal. That is something that we should respect. That is something we should value. And it is something that we promote. Everyone has a role to play in their government. Everyone has a role to play in our societies. And if you believe in something, you have to stand for something.
2013 was the year that the surveillance state was masterminded. 2014 was the year the police state was masterminded and rolled out, I would add. Jury nullification, Stingray spying systems now being mainstream news, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, trying to prove world government was real, even though we had all the documents and statements. The media would say that we were liars. Now it's, yes, world government's real. Yes, secret torture bases are real. Yes, FEMA camps are real. Yes, cancer viruses are in the vaccines, but so what? Now they're just throwing the gauntlet down our faces. And as they get ready to devalue the currency further, as the prosperity leaves, folks are going to find out why they wanted a tyranny in place to begin with. So the party is about to be over, ladies and gentlemen. As David Knight sent me a text today, I said, what are you talking about on the show? And he said, the mask is coming off. And I said, that's exactly what I want to get into. So the mask is coming off of planetary world government. We're going to be breaking that down here on this live January 4th, 2015 global transmission tomorrow. That of 440-something power-producing reactors, another 300 or so research reactors, another couple hundred sub-reactors the Russians and the U.S. have. I don't know, it's got to be over 1,000 reactors total. Why are there so many accidents? Why don't they care now? Why is there this nihilistic attitude about everything, about tyranny, about you name it? And it's because the public has been put into an entertainment trance. And I want to talk about the trance and how they're controlling us coming up the next segment. Or to break down an investigation he's been doing at the bottom of the hour dealing with the surveillance state mask came off in 2013, and all the NSA spying, the social conditioning, the brainwashing, the fake media, that pretty much got thrown in our face in 2013 by the social engineers worldwide. In 2014, the police state got unmasked and came out in the open. And of course, the UN is the savior that will come and save us from all this, we're now told by CNN and others. So why are the masks being purposely ripped away right now? Well, sure, public pressure is part of it, but it's larger than that. There's been big NSA whistleblowers, larger than Edward Snowden, like William Binney and others. They didn't get a lot of attention. Why has the system decided now to be a seniority, like royalty, getting those positions and not ending Obamacare, not even trying to repeal it, not even trying to reform it, not stopping the amnesty at open borders, not stopping executive gun grabbing, gun control, not stopping Obama becoming a dictator? David Knight's going to be looking at that in great detail as well. Again, I'm your host, Alex Jones. People looked at me like I had 7 heads. Now, almost everyone that I talk to agrees with much of what we say. They admit global government run by private corporations is real. They admit we're losing our basic freedoms, but they say, so what? What are you going to do about it? So it's the best of times, worst of times, as I always say, quoting one of the most famous literary minds out there ever, Charles Dickens. Sure, we've won the war. People know the Federal Reserve is a scam and private and owned by foreign families and the British royalty. Sure, people know that a lot of the vaccines have been spiked with chemicals to reduce fertility and give you cancer. That's even mainstream news. Sure, people know that. I mean, people don't trust the system. Gallup had a poll out. Again, 7% approval for Congress. People are most worried about government in America. So we've won that war with the occupational government. People know Washington's occupied. They know London's occupied. They know Paris is occupied. Berlin is occupied by these robber barons. They know that Sydney is occupied. They understand this is going on. They understand Mexico City's occupied. But then how do we go to the next level of getting people to realize we have power and can change it? Because no, there is an enemy, and there is an agenda. The other half is, once you've shown people, it's not meant to demoralize folks. I mean, I've had congressmen on and off record, generals and movie stars tell me, yeah, I used to think you were crazy. Now it all makes sense. I was compartmentalized the whole time. It's all true. I'm just giving up. It's all, no. That's, see, I've become more sophisticated doing this 20 years. I was just trying to warn people. I didn't know it was scaring the hell out of everybody. And then when it all came true, basically, because it was already there, but new chapters came true, people then were like, whoa, oh my gosh, we're doomed. No. A secret conspiracy can only operate if it's secret. Now the Federal Reserve is private last year. We're getting close, folks. That's why they're going to pull false flags, try to get a civil war going, try to get us fighting with local police who are not the problem. That's why they're going to try to get race riots going, because this is what globalists do throughout history. This is what colonial powers do to destabilize areas they're in control of. And now nation states once became empires and colonized areas with brute force. Now we're being colonized by mega corporations that are anti-free market, anti-competition. So that's why all this is happening. And they're responding to it like spectators or like legless, armless creatures that can't fight back because no one's ever been taught how to be politically involved, how to know how things work. The globalists were stalling us while they took over all the institutions, the water districts, the energy districts, the courts. Now that they've taken over much of it, they're throwing it in our face because here's the deal. They intend in their own UN documents, 1021, Cloward and Pevin, the list goes on and on, to end the prosperity to socially control us. That's why they need a physical tyranny in place and a surveillance tyranny in place, because now the other shoe is about to drop, and that's going to be austerity, that's going to be depression, that's going to be major control, that's going to be a gulag-style economy in their own words. So that's the next shoe to drop. I don't know if it's going to be this next year. We're already seeing the incrementalism of it, but it's very, very serious. So I'm begging all of you, realize that you are the resistance, you have the power, and people are never waking up like they are today. But don't take that for granted. Now people are ready to hear the truth. Tell them about Info. Tell them about all of our local AM&F and affiliates, and tell them to tune in at the grocery store, and church, at work, at the red lights, because we're gaining new affiliates every week. We're almost 180 affiliates weekdays to have this platform to talk to millions every day. If we leverage that to the next level, we could change the world. David Knight, we're about to go to break. Tell us more of what's coming up today.
Well, Alex, as you mentioned earlier in the show, 2013 was really a mainstreaming, a reveal of the surveillance state. We saw that with the Snowden documents. And streaming of the militarized police state. It's no longer a conspiracy theory. We've seen it happen. And there's a...
Just discussing what's happening culturally. As we become a society from birth to death that watches television or has about 10, 15 hours of screen time a day, it's grown from 2 hours back in the 50s to 4 hours in the 80s to more than 6 hours for the average person in 2014. We don't have numbers yet on 2015. Some young people have as many as 18 hours a day in their off time and as much as 10 hours a day when they're out of school. And I'm not judging anybody, okay? This stuff is hard to keep away from your kids. It's great to go on a road trip and throw it in the back seat to them. I've done it myself. But you've got to absolutely limit it or keep it away, or it will take your life over, and it is brain damaging the public, where you've got a bunch of spectators who cannot take action, who cannot get involved, who cannot respond, who are not living their own lives, but are being programmed by limited social engineering messages that are coming through the mainstream media and that also still dominate the internet. Because yes, this headline's out of the London Telegraph. UK government crafts anti-terror plan to spy on toddlers. Nursery staff and schoolmasters given duty to report toddlers they suspect of becoming terrorists. Now, this is not new. It's just being expanded. In a film I made 8 years ago called Endgame, we show the BBC articles where they say that they are surveilling babies in the womb for signs of terrorism. This is beyond thought crime. This is genetic crime. And now the state of Washington is now doing the same pre-crime, thought crime, terror crime on babies. Now, if people hear me talk about this, they think that Alex is wacky. No, I'm reading to you out of the London Telegraph today. We have 3 paragraphs snipped to save it and prove it at Infowars.com with a full link to the full article to one of the biggest newspapers in the United Kingdom. So, with NATO, funds and protects Al-Qaeda, calls them ISIS, turns them loose 4 years ago to attack Syria, and now we've got to give our rights up because they're set to attack us again. Our government's telling us. That's why we had that intro at the start of the show, reminding everybody that just a year ago, it was in the news that our own government was funding Al-Qaeda. Now they changed the name to ISIS to confuse us. This is the overwhelming nature of things. The reason they need us to be spectators is very simple. What I'm getting at here is, if you know that you have power, they can't win. But if they can convince you that you don't have any power and that you can't affect change, you have absolutely no way to ever resist. Think about how much of this stuff is now completely out in the open. And it's being done because they've conditioned us to be spectators. They've used high-level psychological warfare systems to roll this out against the people. I talked about this for over 15 years. It's happening now, but you're not allowed to ever see it because of the images. Just like human cloning's been going on at the embryonic level for more than 30 years, it's just not shown to the public, though it's admitted in dry research papers. Pizza Hut and others have eye scanners that will track you when you're reading the menu and tell you what you wanted to order before you order it. Amazon is announcing they will package and ship your package before you order it. They know what you're going to order. That's AP. We are Buck Rogers 2015. These computers now tracking us can basically read our minds. These computers can see over the horizon of mass movements and basically predict the future. So what I'm telling you folks is, you're living in an epic Buck Rogers dystopia. We can change this if people admit the master plan that's being carried out. Okay, do you understand? DARPA and NASA run Google. They run Microsoft. They run it all. It's already artificially intelligent, folks. It's already able to predict the future in almost every case. Now they're creating the Internet of Things with smart dust in everything to track the real world, and they're building a world not to empower humans in the end, but to make us obsolete and bring in a planetary regime. That's why I get hysterical. And not to scare you, but to rally you out of your coma, out of your trance, to break the trance. There's 7.5 billion of us. We can change the future. We can rally humanity and build a technological system to take us to the stars and empower us, not to enslave us and make us obsolete. They're going to roll out all the AI, the brain chips, the retina chips. It's going to start with the contact lenses. You're going to see it all the next few years. It's not 20 years out. It's a year out. It's already here. Their ability to make their own decisions in life. You will lose your free will. This system is the end of humanity as we know it. Not because technology is bad, but because the engineers, the master builders, the social architects are eugenicists following a 166-year-old plan developed by the royal family of England. Look, to bring in a planetary world government that broke up the family as we knew it, micromanaged every facet of society, used weaponized sports to distract the public, drugging of the water supply, that they would seek out and discover how genetics worked. Biometrics was invented by them in 1860. And no doubt these people are visionaries. But they're very anti-human. But with the things they developed, they were able to dominate the globe to a great extent. Now they want full control. They're going to use computers to do that. And yes, there are parallels to the Bible, Mark of the Beast, you name it. If you don't believe in that, that's your issue. The point is, it's manifesting in a very dark, anti-human way, just like the Bible says. The problem is the churches are state-run now, most of them telling you that you're going to be raptured out of it. When that's not even in the Bible, folks. The rapture comes after the tribulation. But regardless, don't you as a Christian, no, ladies and gentlemen, we're living on a planet in deep space. This stuff's going on. Our own species is engaged in predator activities against us.
We are anonymous. We have watched over you in the past years, and we have seen your progress of understanding the world we are living in. We have seen you gather into groups and begun fighting the corporate-controlled corrupt governments. All of you, programmers, workers, social engineers, police officers, hackers, all of you have gathered in small groups and shared your knowledge to what is wrong with this world and what can be done to change it. However, you have made a critical mistake. The information you have must be spread worldwide and all over the internet, not just into your groups. The people that have joined those groups already know the truth, or most of it of course. Our job is to provide evidence to the people that want to see the truth, and spread this knowledge to the people that have no idea of what is going on. It is obvious to see that people are not ignorant, they are either uninformed or disinformed. So we need to inform these people that are still asleep, watching everyday corporate-controlled mainstream television and entertainment-like shows. Millions of people that spend their time talking about foolish things, about what celebrities do. Wake them up, show them and provide to them the evidence needed, so they can see what the true reality is. Of course, most of them will ignore you. But just think how many people we can awake, if we start spreading the truth all over the internet, and in the streets, in which people are just wasting their life and time on nonsense issues. Spread the word, and let everyone know what their mission is. We do not need to fight those corrupt politicians, those corporate paid bankers. Those same people that are trying to enslave the world. Because a well-informed, fearless, and brave human is an impossible target for the New World Order. They know very well they cannot control free men, no matter what laws they make, or false flag operations they create. Let us help our brothers and sisters. Let us create a new world, a world of peace and justice, a world of reason. A world in which every man has everything needed, so we can all evolve together. The human species is a living organism, and evolution cannot be stopped. To these so-called rulers of our world, you are holding all of us back. You cannot hold evolution back.
And all I'm trying to warn you and tell you is there's still enough freedom where this information can get out. Please don't take this for granted. Look into the claims we've made. Look into the facts we're saying. Find out how real this is. Realize you're being manipulated. You're being conditioned. Now, folks know that. They know there's propaganda. They know they're being lied to. But find out, you know, something's stinking under the boards of the basement. Are compartmentalized. The whole system's built on that. They don't know what they're doing. We're here to decompartmentalize. And so just grasp that and get others to grasp it. Do you want to be your own man or woman? Do you want to know how the world really works? Do you want to be free? Do you want to have free will? Do you not want, as MIT reported 2 weeks ago, to have by 2025, half of newborns or half of children will have autism? That's MIT 2 weeks ago. Do you really want to be conditioned? Do you really want to be poisoned? Do you really want to have your free will taken? Do you really want to be soft-killed with binary weapons? Okay, so just know you've been warned. This is going on. I'm honored to be your host. I'm honored to be here 6 days a week. I'm honored to have folks like David Knight, who sits in maybe a day a week or so, does a fabulous job. I'm honored to have him host the nightly news with our other reporters and myself, 7 o'clock weeknights at prisonplanet.tv. I don't claim to have all the answers. I don't claim to be the best deliverer of information. All I know is I'm not a slave. I'm awake. I've got a soul. And I'm honored to be able to talk to all of you who I know have souls as well. And I'm honored to have a great crew of wonderful people.
As you can see, the post is now gone. I posted 2 of them, and the post is now gone. It's just not on my timeline anymore. I only deleted one, and they deleted the other. These will never stop. These disruption tactics, these blocking, deleting, staggering, stalling, these will never stop because they're always designed to establish plausible deniability. Plausible deniability by the CIA, while at the same time rendering the targeted individual's complaints to appear frivolous. Now the post that I made is no longer on the timeline. I've got to go back and redo it again, which is an attempt by the CIA designed to get me to post multiple times to the internet because it looks like I'm unstable if I do that. So you see, these will never end. These are daily, constant disruptions designed to provoke the targeted individual, while at the same time destroying his credibility by rendering his complaints appear frivolous, while at the